Audio test 1 for the meeting stream. Audio test 2 for the meeting stream.
We will start in 1 minute.
Can you just wait for
All right, I think we're almost ready to
I need a
start.
key.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Bonjour à tous. Welcome to this Monday morning's Audit Committee meeting. Just to give you a quick run through of how this is going to go. Our first item to consider today will be the audit of the purchasing card program. We'll hear first from the Auditor General, Natalie Goujon. Then Deputy Auditor General Joanne Gorenstein will provide a presentation on the report. After the presentation, the OAG will take questions from committee members, then from other members of council. We'll go to questions for city staff afterwards. As a reminder, staff responding to questions, if not present in the Champlain Room, are asked to activate their video feature on Zoom if their internet bandwidth allows. Following questions, we'll vote on carrying the item and sending it to council for consideration. Our second item will be the audit of the Climate Change Master Plan. Auditor General Goujon and Senior Auditor Rhea Khanna will provide an approximately 10-minute presentation on this report. The OAG will take questions from committee members, then from other council members. Again, we'll go to questions for staff once questions to the OAG are complete. We'll then vote on carrying the item and sending it to council for consideration. Next, we'll hear an update on the 2023 financial statements from our Finance and Corporate Services Department. Deputy City Treasurer for Corporate Finance, Isabel Jasmine, will deliver a presentation on the results of fiscal year 2023 and financial statement figures. We'll then welcome staff from KPMG to present a summary of their audit findings. We'll vote to receive the report and recommend it to be sent to council. And lastly, we'll consider the report on the city's sinking fund financial statements for 2023. This report will also go to a vote to be received and sent to council for approval. All right, let's get started. Before we proceed, though, I'll ask the committee coordinator to do a roll call of all members.
Councillor Hill,
Present.
Councillor Kavanaugh,
Present.
Councillor Carr,
Present.
Councillor Kitts,
Here.
Councillor Hubley, Councillor Lowe,
Here.
Vice Chair Brown,
Here.
Chair Curry.
Here. Thank you. All right, so declarations of interest. Are there any declarations of interest? Seeing none. The minutes, item 3.1, Audit Committee Minutes 5 from Friday, March the 8th, 2024. Are the minutes noted on the agenda confirmed?
Confirmed.
Confirmed, thank you. All right, item 4.1, Office of the Auditor General, Audit of the Purchasing Card Program.
Merci, Madame la Présidente et chers membres du Comité de la vérification. Le premier rapport que nous souhaitons vous présenter aujourd'hui porte sur la vérification du programme des cartes d'achat. J'aimerais prendre un moment pour remercier le personnel de la Ville pour leur collaboration et leur aide soutenue pendant le cours de nos vérifications. Je vais maintenant céder la parole à la vérificatrice générale adjointe, Joanne Gorenstein, qui va vous présenter les résultats de cet audit. Prochaine diapositive, s'il vous plaît. Oh, notre présentation, s'il vous plaît. If we could share the presentation, please.
Next slide, please. Oh, perfect. Good morning. The purchasing card is a method of procurement available for low dollar value purchases less than $15,000. The city allows purchasing cards to be used for payments over $15,000 if made against a purchase order or other methods approved by supply services or for expedited purchases in exceptional circumstances. The city has 4 types of cards within its purchasing card program, each with its own parameters and restrictions of use. Because they are the most predominantly used, the purchasing card and the corporate card were the focus of this audit. Next slide, please. The objective of this audit was to assess whether the city has established policies, processes, and controls to effectively manage purchasing card activities, including the prudent and transparent use of funds. The audit examined the following key elements: governance, administration, compliance, and monitoring processes in accordance with relevant city bylaws and policies. The audit focused on the period from January 1st, 2022 to December 31st, 2023. Next slide, please. Now to the findings of the audit. The first finding relates to the clarity of the related policies and procedures. The procurement bylaw, purchasing card policy, and purchasing card procedures detail the purchasing card program's objectives, define roles and responsibilities for key stakeholders, and specify activation, deactivation, and reconciliation procedures, along with an escalation process for noncompliance. Established policies and procedures guide the use of purchasing cards, and our audit noted that end users generally have an understanding of expectations. While the policy and procedures offer guidance, they contain often complex and technical language and at times are not sufficiently detailed, which can lead to ambiguity in requirements. For example, neither document talks about the specific circumstances or criteria that should be met to approve exceptions to card limits and when restrictions on types of purchases can be lifted, or when a user should be requesting a corporate card versus a purchasing card. The absence of a clear and specific guidance for the administration and use of purchasing cards could lead to misinterpretation of policies and procedures, ultimately resulting in unauthorized spending or non-compliance. The second finding is related to roles and responsibilities within the monthly reconciliation procedures. As part of the current reconciliation workflow, finance officers are expected to verify whether purchasing card transactions are appropriately authorized by managers. It was noted that because the manager is performing their approval subsequent to the finance officer's review, the finance officer is not in a position to confirm appropriate authorization of the transaction at their point in the workflow. The audit found that the current order of the workflow does not allow finance officers or managers to do their roles effectively and efficiently. Reviews and authorizations can take longer to complete based on availability of supporting documentation, and furthermore, items can get missed, and this was confirmed by our audit testing. A change in workflow such that the manager authorizes the transactions, which would include the validation of the supporting documentation and coding leading to a reconciled transaction before the finance officer receives it in their queue, could result in a savings. Based on our calculations, we identified a potential savings of approximately 5,000 finance officer hours for 2023 had there been a change in the current workflow. Without clarity on specific roles and responsibilities for the review and validation of purchasing card transactions, there is a risk that inaccuracies are not flagged for correction. Furthermore, inappropriate assignment of resources increases the risk of non-compliance and inefficiencies within the process. The third finding relates to training for purchasing card end users. While there are a variety of supporting tools and guidance from supply services and finance shared services available to cardholders and managers, there is no formal training provided on the purchasing card program. The audit identified that some of the existing guidance material was deemed to be outdated and voluminous. Cardholders and managers indicated that they learned how to undertake their responsibilities through other informal coaching and training from coworkers and their own trial and error. The reliance on informal tools or peer guidance rather than formal training may result in unauthorized or poorly documented transactions, circulation of misinformation, compliance issues, and increased strain on finance shared services resources. Next slide, please. The fourth finding relates to the use of the purchasing card versus the corporate card. Both the purchasing and corporate cards have restrictions embedded within them for high-risk merchant categories such as gambling or jewelry stores. However, purchasing cards have additional limitations, barring transactions with travel-related providers and certain other categories such as restaurants or gift shops, which are not restricted for the corporate card. When applying for a card, managers and cardholders need to choose the card type they are requesting. However, as noted previously, there is no clear guidance on which type to select and which merchants are blocked on each card type. This lack of guidance leads to frequent attempts to buy from block merchants, necessitating change requests to unblock them, creating extra work for finance shared services and supply services, and blurring the distinctions between card types, including controls embedded. The audit testing revealed that 9 out of 25 transactions tested for travel and hospitality were made using a purchasing card. In all cases, change requests had to be issued to enable these purchases to be made and unblock these types of merchants. In 2022 and 2023, transactions worth $22 million were made with purchasing cards at merchants technically blocked to purchasing card holders. The lack of clear parameters on card types, merchant restrictions, and card selection, and the interchangeable use of card types by submitting change forms complicates processes, undermines the intent of the financial controls embedded within the cards, and increases administrative workload on supply services and finance shared services. The last finding is related to the enforcement of the purchasing card policy and procedures. The purchasing card procedures outline 2 types of non-compliances, major and minor. Finance shared services are expected to track, identify, and document major non-compliances and monitor and discuss all minor infractions. If a cardholder accumulates 2 major or 3 minor infractions within 12 months, Finance Shared Services has the authority to enforce sanctions on cardholders, including suspending a card. Our audit noted that card suspensions and cancellations are not being enforced due to operational requirements, and therefore the current process is not holding cardholders and their managers accountable for compliance. This could result in a perceived lack of consequences for misusing purchasing cards and also may lead to increased misuse, ultimately affecting the city's financial controls. The audit made 6 recommendations and management agreed with all of them. As part of this audit, we learned that supply services and finance shared services are currently considering introducing a risk-based approach to verification of purchasing card transactions. We understand that this approach would limit the focus of validation activities on transactions deemed high risk as part of the reconciliation process. Sample-based periodic compliance reviews of lower risk transactions would be undertaken at the completion of the reconciliation process. Such a shift is viewed as a way to enhance process efficiency and reduce the burden on finance officers who are currently unable to ensure full compliance and validation of transactions. The OAG is in general support of management moving towards a risk-based approach to the verification of purchasing card transactions, as this approach could result in significant efficiencies and allow for reallocation of resources. However, we believe that addressing the risks identified in this audit report would be essential before transitioning to such an approach. Next slide, please. This concludes our presentation. We would be happy to take any questions committee members may have related to this audit.
Thank you, Deputy Auditor General Gorenstein. I have here that Emily Wilcox from Newell Consulting is also available to answer questions. Yeah. All right. So questions from committee members first for the Auditor General's office. Councillor Kavanaugh.
Thank you. I see that it came in through the fraud and waste hotline. Was this like one time, or was it several times that this came in? Like, was this something that people suspected was problematic?
Thank you for your question, Councillor, through you, Chair. We have had in the past some fraud and waste hotline reports that came in related to purchasing cards. So with that accumulation of a few, that was the precipice of deciding to conduct this audit now, although it had already been approved previously in a previous work plan.
Overall, was it discovered that that it's basically a cost saving to have a purchase card versus the old system?
Thank you for your question, through Chair. While our audit didn't specifically look at the cost savings of the purchase card now versus any previous model, I would believe, and I would imagine management would confirm that it definitely is a more efficient process for lower risk transactions.
Okay, yeah, so, all right, no, I just wanted to see if that was considered as well. Thank you.
All right, I don't see any other questions for the Auditor General. Questions for staff? Councillor Kavanaugh?
I'll just repeat my question about cost saving. Given that there's some recommendations for stricter control of purchasing cars, I just wanted to know overall if there's efficiencies with the card.
Through the chair, yes, I can confirm that this process is much more efficient than the prior process. It does provide efficiencies for low dollar value items. So it's proven itself to be much more less administratively burden and less financial impacts in terms of managing this program.
Does that include monitoring of just to make sure that all purchases are in fact credible?
Through the chair, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Lowe?
Thank you, Chair. One of the recommendations in the Auditor General's report speaks to improving the process for escalations and mandatory training. If one of the things that they noted was a lack of resources or a difficulty using those resources to do that, how'd you carry out those recommendations that you've accepted?
Through the chair, so we are coming out of the pandemic. Obviously, there was a lot of staffing issues and challenges. Currently, right now, a lot of this support is provided by financial shared services. We are pretty much fully staffed, and we are working on a training program in terms of going back out to the client departments, specifically on the purchasing and all the training that we do in financial shared services. We've also added a trainer in my organization, specifically focusing on training the organization. And we have another position out there that we're looking to fill as well. So we do have a compliance and training team that we're staffing up to ensure that we do go out and do that outreach and provide that back into a standard offering through our learning and development from our learning center. So on the HR side, we do have a learning center where we do have a core suite of courses that we offer the organization. And this is one of the ones that we'll be offering through that mechanism as well.
Okay, thanks very much.
All right, seeing no other questions, we have a recommendation to approve. So the recommendation is that the Audit Committee receive the audit report and recommend that Council consider and approve the recommendations. Is this item carried?
Carried.
Carried.
Carried. All right, thank you. Item 4.2. Nathalie.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Le deuxième rapport que nous souhaitons vous présenter aujourd'hui porte sur la vérification du plan directeur sur les changements climatiques. Est-ce qu'on pourrait présenter, merci, prochaine diapositive, s'il vous plaît. Before we speak about the details of our audit, I thought I'd provide some pertinent information for those listening in today and provide a little bit of context. In April of 2019, City Council declared a climate emergency. This declaration directed staff to determine climate change mitigation and adaptation priorities for the city going forward. In January of 2020, City Council approved the Climate Change Master Plan, which we will refer to during our presentation as the plan. This plan is the city's overarching framework for how it will mitigate and respond to current and future effects of climate change. The city's efforts with respect to climate change fall within two areas: mitigation and adaptation. Mitigation referring to the reduction and prevention of greenhouse gas emissions that lead to global warming, as well as adaptation, which refers to preparing and responding to the impacts of climate change and becoming more resilient for the future. The city has committed to short, mid, and long-term targets to reduce corporate and community greenhouse gases. The plan outlines how it will achieve its long-term goal of net zero by 2050, including a total of 8 priority actions to be undertaken in the short term from 2020 to 2025. During the course of our audit, there was a reorganization that was announced just this past April, impacting the ownership of the climate change portfolio. It is important to note that the findings of our audit were communicated well in advance of this organizational change. Next slide, please. The objective of our audit was to provide reasonable assurance that the city has the appropriate plans, strategies, and tools in place to support the achievement of the targets and priority actions that are outlined within the Climate Change Master Plan. The audit examined strategies, plans, and tools in place to support the climate change portfolio, including the areas of governance, stakeholder management, resource management, performance management, and reporting. It is important to note that this is the first audit that my office has conducted linked to climate change. We unfortunately had to limit our scope due to the size and complexity of the subject matter. We know there are key areas that aren't contained in this report within our scope. This was a conscious choice. Due to the maturity of the program, it was deemed important to focus on the governance, structure, and accountabilities, as these are the foundational elements that support success in the future. This level of review, we understand from our subject matter expert that's here with us, is an expectation based on best practices and frameworks. In addition, many projects have yet to progress far enough for us to assess them. Our hopes in the near future is to review further key risk areas. Next slide, please. I would like to now pass the presentation over to Ria Khanna, Audit Principal, who was responsible for leading this audit, and she'll walk you through the results of our work.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Natalie. The first set of findings are related to strategic direction. Roughly 95% of Ottawa's greenhouse gas emissions are not within the city's direct control. They require community action and commitment to achieve the established targets. Priority 7 of the plan is focused on encouraging private action through education, direct and indirect incentives, municipal support, and advocacy for support of individuals and private organizations by senior levels of government. The audit noted that there appears to be a shift in strategic direction with respect to the city's role in relation to community action. There were different opinions on what the role of the city should be in mitigating community greenhouse gas emissions and influencing resident behavior changes. Some felt that given the limited funds available, the city should solely focus on its own assets and operations, indicating that to effect change in the broader community would require other levels of government. Others felt the city needs to use its influence and unique tools available to a municipality to lead, advocate for, and encourage change as much as possible. While the 2023 to 2026 term of council priorities includes a priority related to climate change, specifically a city that is green and resilient, the audit noted that there's no direct reference to community emission reductions, and there were limited community-related actions. Without clear and defined direction, the city will face the risk of inefficient use of finite funds and resources and further delays, which will impact the city's ability to meet its target and public commitments. The second finding is related to priorities. Energy Evolution is the action plan for how Ottawa will meet its corporate and community greenhouse gas emission reduction targets. However, we noted that there was no dedicated or sustainable funding identified when the Energy Evolution strategy was introduced. Given how rapidly and intensely the city is facing the effects of climate change, there's also a need to prioritize adaptation activities. The city is currently in the process of developing its climate resiliency strategy with an intended implementation plan to address the 40 short-term priority risks. We understand that in the short term, there's no plan to establish an overarching prioritized listing of actions that incorporates both major climate change strategies. These two streams of work will likely be competing for the same resources and funding. With no holistic funding strategy, the city may be unable to effectively advance work on both the mitigation and adaptation sides and obtain value for money at the portfolio level. This could also put the achievement of the city's short-term climate change efforts at risk. A realistic prioritization for both mitigation and adaptation efforts is required to support the city in meeting its climate change goals, balanced with other city priorities. Next slide, please. The next set of findings are related to the topic of governance. Despite it being recognized that climate change needs to be embedded in all city departments, the audit noted that accountabilities have not been fully formalized for the climate change outcomes committed to by the city. In the absence of formal accountability structures, and given the limited capacity within departments, there's been heavy reliance on relationships established by the climate change and resiliency team with departmental representatives to support the plan, rather than through formal roles and responsibilities. Our audit also identified that there's a lack of clarity of roles and responsibilities. The climate change and resiliency team is widely viewed as the planning and policy arm of the portfolio, and departments are expected to take a lead role in managing and implementing climate change related projects or initiatives as they have the technical expertise. However, these roles have not been formalized. Without formalized accountabilities at all levels, the city has limited ability to hold departments responsible in achieving climate change targets and outcomes. Furthermore, a lack of clear roles and responsibilities could result in a lack of progress towards committed outcomes and potentially missed opportunities, inefficiencies, additional costs, and duplication of work. The next finding is related to the effectiveness of the Tiger team. The Climate Change Tiger team was created to champion and support the implementation of the plan. The audit found that the Tiger team has primarily been operating as an information receiving body. It has not generally been acting as a decision-making body, nor as an entity that provides strategic direction to advance the climate change portfolio. Without the strategic direction and decision-making of senior leadership, there is the risk that citywide perspectives are not obtained, which could have implications on decisions related to funding, resource allocation, and alignment with operational activities. The next finding relates to the climate change and resiliency team. As the city's center of expertise for climate change, this team provides technical expertise on corporate projects and supports community initiatives. At the time of the audit, the team was made up of 24 staff positions, 15 of which are temporary. As a result, over 50% of the $5 million that is specifically allocated to advance the plan is used for temporary staff salaries, both within this team and other departments to support climate change initiatives. This leaves only 50% of the capital budget available for capital investments. Furthermore, the temporary nature of these positions creates a risk of losing both corporate knowledge and in-house climate change expertise, as well as potentially not achieving targets if funding is not secured for future years. Next slide, please. The last finding is related to performance management and reporting. Management indicated that the city is currently on track for its 2025 corporate emission targets and behind on the 2025 community emission targets based on its greenhouse gas inventories. However, the audit could not verify this as these inventories were still under third-party review at the time of the audit. Furthermore, the audit found that there are limited quantifiable metrics or indicators established to provide insights on the progress towards the city's climate change priorities. We acknowledge, in some cases, sufficient data and systems to measure progress are not yet available. Given the limited metrics and indicators, the audit noted that current reporting provides limited insights on how the city has made progress towards its climate change priorities and outcomes. The most recent annual progress report indicated whether a priority was on track or off track based on whether it was proceeding according to specific milestones. Without clear metrics or indicators to support measurement and reporting, the city has limited ability to measure and demonstrate progress, assess value for money, and effectively make decisions to support the priorities of the plan. Overall, it is well acknowledged that the priorities and targets outlined in the Climate Change Master Plan require collaboration with other levels of government, external industry partners, and the broader community for the city to achieve its long-term goals of net zero by 2050. Our audit found that there is meaningful work ongoing across the city to advance the city's climate change goals. Notwithstanding, it is well known that the city is behind on the 8 priority areas outlined in the plan. The audit highlighted that the city needs to make decisions that will impact the direction, priorities, and resources related to this portfolio. The audit made 7 recommendations. Management has agreed to all of them. Next slide, please. If it pleases the chair, we would be more than happy to take any questions committee members may have related to this audit. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ria. We have 4 delegations that we're going to hear from today. I will just note that we also, when we get to questions for the Office of the Auditor General, we also have Claire Bennett from PwC here to answer questions as well. All right, so delegations. The first delegation is Neil Savaranamamutu. Saravanamutu. Just ask. I was practicing it earlier, Neil. I'm sorry. I got stressed. I'm sure. So you have 5 minutes. Thank you very much for being here. You can, yep, for sure.
Great, thank you very much, committee. So listen, we just heard a summary of the audit. I think it could be summarized in 2 lines. We're falling short on our climate action, and the response that we've had from management is that that's okay. We're doing a reorg. Now, I don't think that's a good enough answer. I hope you don't either. It does raise some more fundamental questions. So I'd like to talk about 6 fundamental questions here. Next slide, please. The first is, when we look at this climate plan, are we looking at a burden or are we looking at an opportunity here? When I hear councillors speak about the plan, I often hear a lot of emphasis on the cost. It's a $32 billion cost, but I never hear anyone talking about the opportunity. I mean, this represents $44 billion in savings or net revenues. So I'd like, I think we need to rethink, is this a burden or is it an opportunity? Next slide, please. And this is not just me making this up. This is straight out of Energy Evolution. So the next time a councillor uses breathlessly uses a $57 billion cost number, let's remember that, first of all, that's cost by City Hall, but it's also more importantly cost by the community itself. But even more important than that, there's $144 billion in savings that come along with those expenditures for a net return of $87 billion. So let's put this in perspective, that this is really an opportunity, but we're treating it like a burden. Next slide, please. Second question I'd like to ask is what we've heard referred to previously is, what is the role of the city in climate action? Are we simply a caretaker of our own operations, or are we a leader who takes the region forward? And as a community member, I hope that it's the latter. I hope that City Hall sees itself as a leader that will take the region forward on climate action. Next slide, please. Because the fact of the matter is that there's a number of actions that members of the community cannot take until City Hall takes action first. One example is with regards to the transition to electric vehicles. And for anyone that doesn't have a driveway, or many people that don't have a driveway, on-street parking is really the only option that they have. So next slide, please. What we see in Montreal is on-street EV parking everywhere where there's where it's required. And these are the sort of actions that City Hall needs to take in order for the community to be able to do their part. So this idea of we can just look after our own sandbox and not worry about the larger community, there's examples where that just doesn't hold. Can I have the next slide, please? The fourth question is, there's a number of regulatory actions that City Hall can take that actually cost nothing. And so we haven't made a lot of progress on some of those, and perhaps it's time to. Building standards is a perfect example. So we've got, looking forward, we've got high performance building standards, essentially looking at the building code and saying, is it good enough? This effectively costs us nothing in fiscal terms of the city budget. This is an action that we can do that, again, will have implications have implications across the community. So can I move to the next slide, please? The fifth question is, we need to be honest here about, does council think that climate action is required? So this is, I've heard a number of council members say, well, what about China? Like Canada's only 1.5% of global emissions and Ottawa's only a much smaller part of that. So why bother? I've also heard councillors say that technology will solve it all. So what, who cares? I would argue both of those arguments are wrong. Happy to go into them in more detail later, but climate is a shared problem. We all have a part to play. It's the same reason that everyone here probably contributes to their recycling program and puts their waste in their green bin. Even though, I do that, I'm 1/1,000,000th of the population of Ottawa. I have no material impact on my own, but collectively we amount to something. Next slide, please. The final question I'd like to ask is, when are we going to restart the annual reporting on emissions? So as you know, the climate change master plan commits us to annual reporting on what our emissions levels are. We haven't had this since 2020. Obviously, there's been a couple of years that have happened since then. We've got our first medium-term target coming up next year. We'd like to know whether we're on track or whether we're moving in the right direction. So just last slide, please. So the big question for council, like we really have to decide, are we leaders here or are we simply caretakers? And if we're going to be leaders, let's lead. And finally, can we please live up to our promise of reporting annually on those emissions? I've written quite a bit on this. That's the Substack where I write it all if anyone's interested in seeing more. Thank you very much.
Perfectly on time. All right, questions for Mr. Saravanamutu. Was that better?
Well done.
Council members, committee members first, Councillor Carr.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. I just have a question with respect to your first slide. You talked about the reorganization. Do I take from your presentation that you don't think the reorganization is a good idea, or you were concerned about it overly being focused on as an audit recommendation?
Well, more the latter, Marty. I'm concerned that saying that a reorganization is going to solve all our problems is not the right way to go about it. I have no particular comment on the reorg itself because I don't know the details of it. But to say that by a reorg is going to address all of these outstanding issues, I don't find that's a suitable response.
Okay, I kind of took it when I read it that the reorg was needed in order to help us move forward, because when I look at the comments on the current organization, the temporary nature of positions, lack of clear roles and responsibilities, Tiger team not providing direction, departments not being assigned specific targets, that I thought it was more an initial step in order to realign, get people directly responsible. We now have a whole area that's responsible for climate change, pulling those resources together, and then hopefully get back on track to making the progress that I think we all want. But I just wanted to get clarification of that.
Sure.
But thank you for coming.
Councillor Kavanagh.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Neil. In terms of the presentation from the auditor, we heard about the 5 million and that half of it is for staff and half of it is, I'm not sure, the other half is programs or something. But I just wanted to get feedback on where staff fit in, how much we need of staff, and how we balance that out. And I just wanted to know where that fits in with your recommendations of spending.
Well, look, 5 million is a fairly modest amount. And so obviously we need to use it. We need to think strategically and wisely about how we would allocate that. What I would say, and a lot of the discussion that I've seen is, should it just be on corporate emissions? Should it be all on mitigation versus adaptation? And to be honest, I actually think that's the wrong answer, to try to just put it into one bucket or another. I think we should turn this back to staff and say, where is the highest return on a marginal investment? As I say, it's a pretty small amount. So let's do whatever gets the highest bang for the buck. And the other thing I noticed too is that the Federation of Canadian Municipalities came out a few days ago with a $500 million fund dedicated to adaptation. So that's, if you think about what Ottawa's share, like fair share should be of such a fund, we're probably looking at $10-15 million or more, which is far more than the small amount we're talking about. So again, Councillor, I would say that if we're thinking about how we allocate that $5 million, let's leave it up to the experts to tell us where we'll get the highest bang for our buck.
Okay, assuming that's staff who are the experts, not sure. But in terms of the benefits that you were talking about, 87 billion, what is like the low-hanging fruit of that? What is something that we should do like right away?
Yeah. Well, for instance, retrofitting buildings leads to energy savings. That's something that can be done on the corporate account. It's important, but it's important to remember that most buildings, of course, out in the city are not city assets. They're privately owned. And so then the question becomes, how do we go about incentivizing individuals to retrofit their homes or their businesses or other organizations? And, for instance, one of the things that I would love to see that other cities are doing is trying to take home retrofits from being a personal project that I need to do and figure out on my own and come up with the financing to actually project manage it for a whole street or a whole block or a whole neighborhood at a time, so that individuals can simply sign up to, yes, I want my home retrofit. I don't really want to become an expert in energy efficiency, but I'm happy if there's a trusted partner provided by the city that can do that for me. So those are the sort of actions where I think we can, there is low-hanging fruit.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Councillor Hill? We can't, are you talking? We can't hear you.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Perfect. Thank you very much for the presentation. Mr. Sir Venemuto, you mentioned that you want to see us looking at where is the highest return for a marginal investment. And I'll go back to your 3-point slide about, China versus technology versus, looking at our own backyard. And is it not fair to say that, looking to get the highest return for marginal investment would be looking beyond the 0.001% of the global greenhouse gas emissions that are emitted from Ottawa and trying to find with our technology park partners, broader solutions that do involve technology so that we're actually working in an environment where we're not limiting ourselves to less than 1% solution space and actually working in an area where we can address 99.99% of the problem.
So Councillor, I don't fully understand your question, but again, I think it's the wrong analysis to say that because Ottawa represents some tiny percent of, some tiny fraction of global emissions, that the people of Ottawa should, that this should not be a priority. Again, we should be looking, and yes, we should be using technology to its full extent. The question is, how do we leverage technology to get the biggest reduction in impact in emissions throughout the region? So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but again, on the China question and the fact that we are a tiny share of emissions, I come back to the example of recycling and of organic food waste. And again, I'm sure pretty much everyone in this room recycles. Pretty sure everyone in this room puts their food waste into the organic stream, and each of us acting individually has zero impact. Okay, the fact that I put my organic waste into my green bin has no impact on when Trail Road will fill up. But if we all do, we can extend the life of Trail Road, and that's why it's wrong to say that because we are Ottawa is such a tiny share of global emissions that we have a free pass.
Yeah, so a little bit on the language there. You commented that, Ottawa shouldn't get a free pass, and you've also commented that, we shouldn't say that it's not a priority. And I don't think the Auditor General report is saying either of those two things, and I don't think that City Council has said either of those things either. I think it's just, there has been some challenge function to say, from an economic perspective, are we balancing all of the priorities that we have from a city perspective? You brought up the high performance development standards as well, which is a good example. I think your comment was that this effectively costs us nothing. Well, I would suggest, that that's not accurate, because it does cost. There are costs that go with reducing your supply chain options when you're investing in housing. And I get the balance that goes with that, because you're right. If we had a perfectly efficient building and structures, that would certainly be a vast improvement from the requirement for energy management. But at the same time, if we're costing builders out of the city such that they're building 90 to 120 minutes outside of the city, then having people drive to qualify into these small towns that are surrounding Ottawa and then drive on our infrastructure, that's not good for the environment either. So I do think that there is a balance that needs to be struck when we look at that. And I would also highlight that, we are looking, at this point at a harmonized building code that's going to come in from the federal and provincial governments as well. So I appreciate the comments that you bring to it, and I always appreciate the function that you raise and the passion that you bring with it. And I appreciate your time today, Mr. Servan. Thank you.
Great. Well, listen, I mean, if we want to talk about, when I say effectively no cost, I'm talking about effectively no cost to the city. There might be obviously some consulting costs, et cetera, but in a $5 billion plus budget, that's marginal. You're saying that there's cost to home builders. I mean, let's not forget that this council just agreed to development charges that are significantly larger. And so what, what's the difference between those charges that you agreed to, a week or two ago versus what we're talking about now? But more importantly, with high performance development standards, there are upfront costs, but they will reduce the overall they will increase the energy efficiency of the home and reduce the overall lifetime costs of servicing that home. So it's the impact on the building industry, I don't think is quite as clear cut, and on home sales is quite as clear cut as you say.
So having had a pilot in my ward whereby geothermal was used to offer a green premium to townhouses at $670,000 versus a $600,000 townhouse that had natural gas. 9 out of 10 new home buyers wanted the cheaper version because they are looking at the bottom line when they buy the house right now. And if they can't find something at cost that is reasonable, then they are going to drive to qualify. That's the bottom line. But I appreciate your time, as I said, Mr. Saravano. That's all for me, Madam Chair.
Sorry, we're not going to be debating back and forth here. We might be here all day, but we understand you have a difference of opinion here. But you have another question for you from Councillor Devine.
Hey, Neil, thanks for the presentation. Just a couple questions. When you were talking about the potential in one of your first slides, you talked about rather than seeing this as a cost, we can see this as an opportunity. And I don't remember the figure, but you had a chart that described potential other revenues and sources of funding that might, balance out on the positive end. Can you give me a little bit more detail? Are those revenues and other sources of funding you saw tied to energy evolution, might those be revenues over a certain number of years? Because I can fully understand that there's a capital investment up front, but that it pays out in the long run, just like to a certain extent what you're talking about to every homeowner. But when you were talking about those revenues, is that something that spans out over roughly how many years, do you know?
Yes, over 30 years. And you're right that typically certainly with our climate plan, there's a heavy investment over the first 10 years, and then there's a large payoff over the subsequent 2 decades. And that actually goes back to Councillor Hill's comment about a lot of people not wanting to make the upfront payments. And it actually speaks to the role of government, that city government could come in and offer financing programs to smooth that out. That's something that's entirely possible that would have a very big return, I believe.
I do agree with you. I often think that the decisions that we as politicians make are not focused on tomorrow, but 25, 30 years from now. And whereas it might be hard, and I love when you're nodding your head there, and whereas it might be hard for an individual homeowner to look at those immediate costs, that is the role of government, where we can lay in place, hopefully, a better future 25, 30 years from now. Another question I have for you there, when you were talking about, do we see ourselves as caretakers or as leaders in a regional area? May I assume that the analogy you're making there is whereas the caretaker option is the city minding its own corporate assets, but the regional leader is the city taking a leadership role in the 95% of GHGs that come from community action?
That's exactly right. I mean, if we think about other large organizations in the city, so as you mentioned, the city accounts for 4 or 5% of total emissions. Think about an organization like Walmart. They probably, I'm guessing, they probably account for a couple of percent of global emissions. Of local emissions from their operations throughout Ottawa. So the question is, are we just like the same as Walmart? Is the city of Ottawa no different than Walmart? Do we not have a different responsibility, a different role to play? Of course we do. We are the local government. We are the leaders of this city.
And I suppose the question I had from that, when you were saying that, does the city see itself as caretaker or as leader, is it your understanding from the AG report that the AG report itself was leaning in one direction, or are they themselves asking that same question?
Well, the AG report is very clear that we are not doing enough on mobilizing and helping community action. So in that sense, I believe that my interpretation of the AG report is that it's obviously it's important that we look after our corporate emissions. But we have, our plan says we will also play a catalytic role in the other 95%. And the AG report is pointing out that we're falling short on that front.
Quite true. And oftentimes when, individual homeowners, they often do look to government, say, well, what are you going to do to make this easier for me in the first place? Going back to your overall comment about the response from management in the report itself, I did see your point to a certain extent. I, like many of my colleagues, are eager to see the tangible benefits that come from a structural reorg, but I do share the point you made in that it did seem that the response from management was lacking only in the fact that it seemed like every response to recommendations was just a reiteration of we're going through a reorg, rather than offering a substantive response to each recommendation. My last question, going back to the roles that cities can play. So on high performance development standards alone, are you aware of other cities in Canada, even in Ontario, that have taken a proactive response on building retrofits? For example, I think Toronto's had high performance development standards in place for 20 years. Guelph has standards in place. Are you aware of any tangible benefits from cities that have had these retrofit programs in place for a lengthy amount of time?
Well, if we look at the Canadian context, Vancouver has had these programs in place for a long time and has been a cornerstone of much of their climate action. We've seen Toronto making some great progress. We've seen Montreal making great progress too. So the three major cities in Canada have all adopted this and run with it in some cases for many years. And so I can appreciate that we haven't moved forward on it because of discussions with the provincial government and potential actions from the provincial government, which never quite materialized, but the time to move forward on them is now.
And from those other Canadian cities that are taking a leadership role and being seen as leaders nationally and internationally, do you know whether those cities, the leadership behind those cities, have taken a similar, well, for lack of a term, what about China response? Or are those cities putting that aside and does it seem like they're being responsible for their own actions?
Well, listen, I mean, this is a fundamental question that every city council needs to address, is that do we look at ourselves in the global context and say that we represent effectively 0.0% of this global problem, or are we going to lead by example and actually be part of the solution that we require thousands of municipalities around the world to do? But there's actually a more one of the other reasons that cities have taken action on emissions so proactively is that we have to remember that emissions are actually local air pollution. So I think it's 15% of kids in Canada now have asthma, which is double the rate it was a couple of decades ago. And that's because of local air pollution. That's the tailpipe emissions that we are that we have not moved quickly enough on in reducing. Across Canada, there's 15,000 people a year that die prematurely from air pollution. Now, air pollution are emissions. And so as a city, we can say, well, we're not a big enough part of the problem, but we are, by failing to take action, we're having an impact on the health of our local community.
And as I understand it, our emissions per capita in Canada are higher than most G7 nations. And with the majority of populations moving to cities, the responsibility is more and more upon cities to take action on this.
Councillor Devine, your time is up.
Yep.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Saravan.
Thank you.
Our next delegation is William Van Geest.
Thank you, Chair. Are you able to hear me okay?
We can.
Great, thank you. So yes, thank you for the opportunity to address you. I'm doing so on behalf of Ecology Ottawa. We're grateful for an audit of the Climate Change Master Plan. To implement a plan properly, of course, it's imperative to have occasional checks. And there are, of course, few issues of greater concern than climate change. If anything, we would prefer more reporting. The greenhouse gas inventories, for example, are overdue, as the audit itself acknowledges, and we haven't seen a CCMP update for 2023 yet, and it's already June. So again, this audit is welcome, even if it does have some shortcomings, some of which I'll mention. But first to the audit's content. It confirms things that Ecology Ottawa has been saying. One thing is lack of funding. We delegated to the Environment and Climate Change Committee last November to ask for increased CCMP funding. The $5 million in the city's last two budgets, while a start, is far too little. While there have been other investments into specific parts of the plan, like electric buses, many of these investments are one-time. And even with these investments, we couldn't be remotely close to the $687 million annually that the plan calls for. This brings up one of the audit's shortcomings. We shouldn't need to imagine how we're doing with investments. These numbers should be in the audit. This is particularly relevant given that CCNP spending will ultimately yield substantial savings. While net annual savings and revenues were supposed to exceed annual investments already in 2032, as the previous delegate mentioned, with a net community-wide return of $88 billion by 2050. $88 billion. Are we on track with these projections? We've seen no evidence that we are, but we just don't know. And not knowing this means we don't know what's necessary to catch up, or the significantly greater investments we'll eventually have to pay reactively because we didn't spend proactively. The audit also observes a misalignment between the CCNP and Council's desires, as the presentation mentioned earlier. This partly relates to Council's decision last December, one that staff and groups like Ecology Ottawa opposed, to focus our efforts on corporate emissions, even though they're only 4% of our total emissions. It's no wonder then that management thinks that we won't meet our community emissions targets, the other 96%. But the audit didn't observe the misalignment between Council's will and the public. Ottawans strongly support climate action. For example, our petition on climate change last summer, as wildfire smoke blanketed our city, received 1,200 signatures, and another 600 emails were sent to Mayor Sutcliffe and councillors. Moreover, the motion that I just mentioned was walked on to committee, which means that Ottawans had no opportunity to address the committee on it. Still on the topic of misalignment between council and the public, it's strange that the audit took the term of council priorities as its reference point, since they incorporated no public input whatsoever. The reference point should have been the official plan, which involved extensive public consultation and even the province's approval. Further to the term of council priorities, we believe the audit interprets one aspect incorrectly. It observes that the priorities don't mention GHG emissions, only climate adaptation. But the priorities call for a green and resilient city, and green here must imply GHG mitigation. To be sure, this is a problem with the priorities, which should have used precise language. We're concerned that if the audit's interpretation of the priorities is permitted, it could be an excuse to not mitigate greenhouse gas emissions, which of course is a crucial part of climate action. So I would ask that staff confirm that green in the priorities indeed includes mitigation. Finally, management's response to the audit's 7 recommendations. These are unacceptably slow. We're to expect a governance framework in Q4 of this year, a prioritization framework by Q2 of next year, and a funding and resourcing strategy by Q4 of next year. This does not, I think you'll agree, align with the climate emergency that Council declared in 2019. We urge action commensurate with the severe threat that climate change poses. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Van Gies from Ecology Ottawa. Questions from committee members to the delegation, Councillor Carr.
Hi, thanks, William, very much for your presentation today. I'll just make a comment. I don't know if it's really a question or more of a comment. With respect to your comment about the lack of reporting and also about the timeframes, I think it will be important for me to clarify during staff questions as to what activities we can expect during the timeframes that they are coming to, that they are redoing the budget, that they are reprioritizing, because it's not clear to me what activities will be ongoing in support of the climate change master plan during that time. Because certainly I hope that we can continue the progress we are making and not slow that down. I'll also mention, you mentioned about the official plan not being noted in the audit. That was something that really stuck out to me, given that the official plan is such a critical tool in terms of climate adaptation and climate mitigation. And it is also the overarching document that will allow us to implement the new zoning bylaw. And of course, zoning along with bylaws being one of the most, being the tools that we do have in order to regulate emissions. So I did note the absence of that as an important document in the audit as well. But mostly just thank you for coming out today.
Yeah, thank you. Those are 2 points that really concern us as well. What is going to happen with the CCMP's implementation while we wait for these various deliverables from the climate team, and as you mentioned as well, the zoning bylaw and other items like the HPDS. These are all critical aspects to mitigating community emissions.
Yeah, 100%. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Hill.
Thank you, Mr. Van Geest. I appreciate the comments. I guess what I would challenge is it not fair to look at the pace with which we're implementing new planning, on this portfolio, on others as well, and say that a measured approach to looking at our procurement processes, to looking at the available technologies, to looking at, other municipalities, that there's a value in a measured approach so that we don't run too quickly and trip and end up further behind where we would otherwise be. I can understand the desire to get to that ultimate goal, as quickly as possible. But, there's a time to sprint and there's a time to pace oneself. And my concern, and we've seen this on other projects as well, I could list a myriad. We'll start with the LRT procurement for phase 1. We had a public inquiry on that, despite the fact that I don't think anybody would have said that having an awesome public transit system for the city of Ottawa is good for commuters, it's good for the environment, etc. But we ran too quickly and we tripped on ourselves. And one of the concerns that I have when we look at the vast expanse here that we have in terms of investment vision is to make sure that we get it right. We've invested a ton of money, both at all 3 levels of government, in our electric bus system. We need to make sure that system is a good system. We need to make sure there's off ramps in there in case that there are problems, but we need to make sure for the taxpayers and for the transit riders, that's a good system. And going quickly is putting us at risk financially of getting ourselves into another boondoggle. And so that is my concern when we talk about pacing. And so I appreciate your interest and engagement on wanting to go quickly, but I just wanted to offer that as a comment, Mr. Van Geest. Feel free to come back at me if you wish on the issue of, that balance between fiduciary responsibility, a measured approach, and the pace to address the crisis.
Yeah, thanks for your points, Councillor. And obviously, I appreciate your position as one of the decision makers, of accountability on all the expenses, all the investments that council makes. I would say in response, climate is a little bit different. This is an emergency situation, as council itself declared, right? And climate change doesn't wait for us. We can do with another, say, year of delay in LRT service. Which is actually currently happening. And there aren't massive kind of societal losses. We've seen tornadoes. We've seen, in your own ward even, we've seen flooding. We've seen, the wildfire smoke blanketing our city. We can go ahead and delay, but all of the, the costs that those are going to incur are only going to increase. So, we have a choice to work proactively now, or pay a heck of a lot more on a reactive basis later. It certainly seems like the effects of climate change are accelerating. I realize that, measuring that on a global scale is a tricky thing. But again, I think the emergency nature of climate change demands that, we do better than a measured approach. And also say that $5 million to implement the CCMP is not, even if a lot of that, ended up being going to measures that were less impactful, $5 million is a very, very small sum compared to, for example, the road widenings that we're doing in the city, right? So I think we can afford to take more than a measured approach, really a proactive approach. And I think the financial returns themselves will prove that to be the right approach to be taken.
Thank you, Mr. Van Geest. All right, so our next, thank you for coming to delegate today. Our next delegation is Angela Keller-Herzog from Cafes. And you have some slides for us that we'll get up there.
Okay, good morning, everybody. So yes, I'm Angela Keller-Herzog with Cafes. Next slide, please. So this is our first time at Audit Committee. I know many of you, but it's always great to have a first time for another committee. Cafes, I think most of you know, we're a network of environmental and climate leaders. We have individual and organizational members now from all wards of the city. Next slide, please. That's the overview. Next slide, please. So first of all, the context, as has been already started to be discussed, the strategic direction for climate actions for the city, creature of the province, comes in part from provincial legislation, the policy statements, and also requirements in asset management. We also have major obligations from a climate lens on the official plan on some of the big moves. We have the term of council priorities, and then we also have a 5-year update and review cycle that is planned for in the climate change master plan architecture. Next slide, please. So I think that sort of context is important to understand the audit findings. So first of all, Cafes really welcomes this audit and that this audit was undertaken and the recommendations. Many of those recommendations, in fact, echo things that we have been saying in public delegations for several, like many years now. The highlight obviously is that we want to see public metrics and reporting so that there's accountability and transparency. And this is important for councillors and this is important for the public. So let's go for that. Thank you. Next slide, please. So in terms of the audit, there are some gaps, though, that we would like to point to. The scope of the audit and the framework of the audit included stakeholder management, yet there are no recommendations, nothing on stakeholder management in the audit itself, in the audit findings. We think that there is a complete structural gap in Ottawa in terms of a functioning public stakeholder engagement mechanism for climate. There used to be structures and they're all defunct now. And at the same time, Ottawa has a vibrant technology sector. There are corporations in Ottawa spending millions in terms of energy transition and climate, and they're leaders, global leaders. There is a vibrant civil society community that is prioritizing climate, yet there's no mechanism for a conversation and collaboration with the city, which we need obviously to move forward on community emissions results. And the energy transition that is at the center of all this, a key stakeholder is Ottawa Hydro. So to have the city have a stakeholder relationship on this absolutely critical core part of the energy transition here in Ottawa, and to have that not mentioned in stakeholder management, we think is a huge gap. Next slide, please. Okay, climate risks is the other big gap. The city has done significant homework in this area. There are big reports, many pages that most people haven't read, but some of us avid climate watchers have. The city has identified 40 critical climate impact risks. We have steeply rising climate costs. So where is the long-term financial plan for climate mitigation and adaptation? These are red flags that are ignored. So another huge gap. Next slide, please. So then looking at the management response, we are a bit worried in the sense that we have a reorganization going on that hopefully is an opportunity, yes. We have a promise for a reprioritization, and we have a promise for figuring out roles more clearly. So will all of this lead us into a whole year of delay and confusion because we don't know who are the managers, we don't know who are the leaders, we don't know what are the priorities. So we really think there needs to be some kind of direction for there to be a work plan so that we know and can be assured that the team that we have are still basically engaged in effective implementation of the climate master plan. Next slide, please. So our recommendations then are to ensure that the audit follow-up provides impetus for more effective action. And this is really the point of having a performance audit. It's so that we can do better. So we'd like to see this audit, which we very much welcome, translate into better action. And we think that especially in this very vulnerable next year, we would like to maybe have council direct staff or ask staff that there should be a work plan so we know that stuff is getting done. And I'm quite in support of what the earlier delegation said. We want to have effective impact. We want to make the performance metrics public, please, and we would like to harmonize the cycle of prioritization coming out of this audit with the 5-year prioritization update cycle of the climate change master plan, rather than piling another prioritization the next year.
Right.
And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm sure you'll have questions for you. Angela, 2 things. Number 1, thank you very much for coming to the Tech Park the other day for the Urban Land Institute event and asking Nokia, based on their new construction, exactly what they were doing. Because the answer was so interesting that is a big part of their bottom line of making sure their buildings are energy efficient and not having a lot of emissions. So that was one thing. Number 2, in terms of your Hydro Ottawa comment, when this report comes to council on the 25th, which is a Tuesday, right? The Tuesday council meeting, Hydro Ottawa will be giving us their annual plan at the same time. So that'll be an opportunity to ask Hydro Ottawa questions right there with this, basically on the agenda, just so everybody knows. So, okay, questions for Angela. You know what, Councillor Menard, I'm going to go to you first because thank you for being here as chair of the Environment and Climate Change Committee. So I'm going to go to you first.
Thanks very much, Chair. And Angela is also a resident, and appreciate your advocacy and all the the free time that you put in because you care about this topic, Angela. Your volunteerism is very appreciated across the city. I did want to delve into the stakeholder engagement issue, and maybe I should just start to also thank the auditor and team for this really important work. And at its heart, shows how much the city, I think, needs to take this seriously and get a plan in place that will resonate with both community and council table. So thank you for all your work. Angela, I wanted to delve into the stakeholder engagement issues from your public delegation. So we have excellent stakeholder groups. I know the vice chair knows this as well, already established with deep knowledge and people ready and willing to take action right across the city. I have asked in the past that these groups be incorporated into a working group along with city staff. We've done that on many files, things like the solid waste master plan and other files have incorporated city staff with the public that's engaged on these issues, and it's worked tremendously. This I think would work very similarly. So I'm wondering, what can the city do to ensure better stakeholder collaboration on climate action? Why is it such a gap right now, and what can be done in your view?
Thank you very much for the question, Councillor Menard. So I'll answer at 2 levels. I think that firstly, like structurally, right now we are at this interesting situation of a complete vacuum, because we used to have the Environmental Stewardship Advisory Committee, right, which advised the Environment Committee and Council. That has been discontinued. We used to have a climate sounding board when a lot of the work went on to develop energy evolution and the climate master plan. There was an active consultation forum where there was, I forget how many people, maybe there was like 30 or 40 stakeholders that had been invited, identified, and we would have meetings and discussions and breakout tables and all kinds of things. And that has discontinued. And then we also had the mayor's environmental roundtable, which also hasn't met this year and seems to have is inactive. Let's put it that way. So there's this like complete absence of how do we have an organized conversation about these things, with the exception of, I suppose, 5-minute public delegations, which is not, that fulsome. The second level is, how can the city actually have good engagement with community? And I think that, again, there's many different models possible. But for example, this past Saturday, we were in Alta Vista and we were talking about, well, basement flooding. So you might think that that's like a pretty mundane topic, but we had a couple of representatives from the city and stormwater management. We had Councillor Carr there. We had people from the insurance sector there, right? And that were explaining a bit to residents how that works. And then we had residents asking excellent questions. So those kinds of community dialogues and engagement things, that's something that your like civil society organizations can help organize so that we have a much more vibrant conversation in terms of the way forward. And I think, like with everything else, like the city alone is not going to be as effective moving things than if we work together.
Thank you. Vice Chair of the Environment and Climate Change Committee, Councillor Carr.
Thank you very much, Chair Curry. Thank you, Angela, for coming here today, and thank you for your work always with outreach and for inviting me this past weekend. I think that's a great example of the level of stakeholder engagement, the community involvement that's so important. I know you heard me say at that meeting when I woke up, late in the evening on August 10th, when I had hundreds of calls coming into my office because of the flooding of Alta Vista, which was the ward with the most reported floods. I had no idea what to do. I no idea how to help these people, the programs that existed. And I think it's really important that we have those kind of engagements. I'm going to follow the Councillor Menard's questions on stakeholder engagement, because he spoke a lot about community groups. But the one piece that I found that was sort of missing, and I was surprised there wasn't recommendations around it. Well, it's twofold, really. One, I didn't see any mention of Indigenous communities in terms of engagement. And the second piece is, I think one of the challenges that I feel with the environment is that there isn't a lot of coordination between the federal and provincial levels of government who have the ability to regulate many of these things. And the municipalities have tremendous responsibility and opportunity in terms of the fact that we're responsible for transit, we're responsible for parks, we're responsible for all these great things, but ultimately a lot of the regulation comes from feds and province, and we don't know really what they're doing. There are different programs that are introduced, and in your world where you're actively engaging, how much of engagement do you have with those different levels of government and with Indigenous communities?
Thank you for that. Okay, so that was a lot. So a lot of people might say that I don't have a lot of boundaries. I work all the time. Like, it doesn't matter if it's Sunday, which is a problem. But one of the boundaries that Cafes has is that we focus our work on the local level and on the municipality. So when it comes to doing advocacy work at the federal level, I mean, I know I'm sitting in Ottawa and occasionally like, okay, you can persuade me to talk to my MP or MPP, but most of the time it's like, no, we have boundaries. And actually, I think the same thing is true for the city, right? So we have to be aware which tools are in the city toolkit, what the city can effectively impact, right? And yes, we have to understand how that relates to actions by other government levels, and we can have funding, which we can use to leverage. So we're working in the larger context, but we need to focus on what we can do here locally. And I think that what I've read is about 50% of climate action and emissions and adaptation is municipally controlled, right? So this whole thing about the 95 to 5 on the emissions front, it's a little deceptive statistic, right? Because let's take the example of transportation. If the city offers active transportation options that are safe so that you can be, say, like an older person that's not like a crazy risk taker teenager, but you can still use a bicycle to, get from point A to point B if you're in the inner urban area. Or if you want to use public transit, is that an option for you living in a suburb? My mother lives in a rural area, and where she lives, there is public transit in the rural area. This is in British Columbia. So there's options where we can have systems change and changes in what is convenient and possible for citizens. And those changes can only be made by the municipality. Those are not within the individual control of people. And these are not federal or provincial things. So I think that's what we need to focus on in this climate master plan. And it's a big scope. And lastly, I don't want to ignore the question on the Indigenous dimensions. So the City of Ottawa has a protocol in terms of our Indigenous relations, which mostly focuses on ceremonial, cultural, and maybe some artistic protocol. And if you wanted to be really ambitious, I think that in the governance review, you would start talking to staff about maybe we should have an environmental dimension to that cultural protocol with the Algonquin Nation. That would be very exciting ambition.
Perfect. Yeah, that's a great suggestion. Thank you very much for coming today. And I'll just mention, you also talked about community missions and the importance of public reporting. I think you talked about how important that is. I think that is something that, trying to wrap my head around how can we possibly report about what's going on in the community and how it's helping Ottawa overall. And I think of the example of hospitals. I think hospitals are like the second biggest emitters of carbon, but we've got the brand new campus being built with the district heating plant. I was just at CHIO 3 weeks ago. They just got $1 million to completely retrofit their systems. I mean, these are things that are going to make a big difference to our community emissions, but how do we capture all of that activity that's happening in terms of our reporting out? You want to say something?
It's actually dead simple. Like, you just get the utility bills that, like, when you get your gas bill, gas is a fossil fuel, like for anybody that was forgetting that. And you just figure it out from that, right? And you don't have to have like weird models with weird parameters, but you go with the actuals, and there's also stats about how much gas like we're buying, right? There's like fuel reports. There's some private sector outfit. You can download them. City has a subscription, I'm sure. So the basics of our energy consumption, you can actually get the actual data, and I know there's a lot of complication when it comes to carbon accounting and yada, 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 but Ottawa is not the only city. Everybody on the planet is doing this, and the city has reported on emissions before. So it's actually like the bulk of it to find out whether the city's community emissions are going up or down. It's a couple of transactions. And again, yes, you have to have a good relationship with your Enbridge and your hydro and get over the privacy concerns and all that. But then it's simple.
It's great to have delegations. We're doing the Lansdowne audit next meeting, so I expect we'll have lots then too. But thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Councillor Devine.
Thank you, Chair. Angela, you're a volunteer, right?
Mostly.
Well, you dedicate a lot of hours in a volunteer capacity. Your passion is off the charts. Your insight and expertise is extremely valuable. On the subject of stakeholder engagement, I can't think of a smart, effective, responsible organization that would not want to capitalize on the value that persons such as yourself, experts from Ecology Ottawa, persons like Mr. Saravanamatu, I cannot think of an organization that would not want to grab that amount of care and use it for the full benefit of the corporation that embraces people like yourself. So on the subject of stakeholder engagement, I very much appreciate it whenever I hear any delegate or a council member speaking, and I'll see some of our auditors, whether you know it or not, nodding your head, that's sending signals to me. So when you were talking about stakeholder engagement and that there's a gap in stakeholder engagement from the public, and I see auditors nodding their head, that makes me think, all right, there's something that we're clearly missing here. I do believe that climate change is an all hands on deck aspect. I believe that the best government collective action is when that communication is a two-way street. I think Councillors Menard and Carr spoke to this, but when you said in your comments that there used to be structures in place for public stakeholder engagement on climate, were you referring specifically to, I think you said the Environmental Stewardship Advisory Committee? And if so, how long ago was that body in place? last term?
So I mentioned three formal
the mayor's
mechanisms.
group.
So the ESAC, the Stewardship Committee, which has been discontinued by the first kind of round of the governance review mechanism that we have. And then secondly, there used to be a sounding board that the Climate Resiliency Unit used to run. So it was an active stakeholder conversation, including hydro, by the way. And then the other thing was the mayor's environmental roundtable. So these were all three formal structures that right now are defunct.
So if they are defunct and if there is a current gap in public stakeholder engagement, I'm not sure how granular AG can get in their recommendations. So I'm not sure whether or not there's agreement from the Office of the AG about resuscitating some of those bodies. I don't mind asking you questions about that, about whether or not you would recommend the resuscitation of those bodies, whether that process is in place or not, and whether or not staff would accept it. I very much appreciate that if we have declared in our term of council priorities that Ottawa be a green and resilient city, and if there is value in that kind of stakeholder engagement, I would certainly love to see it within the rest of the term of council priorities. I am very enthusiastic by what might come of, for example, the Rural Summit, where there's been an extensive consultation with residents to address what is identified as a key issue, and actions will come of that. I'm not sure when that summit is over, but if Ottawa has a vacancy on its summit calendar sometime in the next few years, perhaps if we have identified that climate is a problem that we all must grapple with, then perhaps that is the next summit that the City of Ottawa takes on. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Our next delegation is
No,
Joan.
Teresa.
Oh, sorry. Teresa had her hand up for you, Angela. Sorry.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. I put it up while Sean was speaking, so you may not have seen me. Thank you. Just a closing. I guess I'll be the last one. Angela, thank you. One of the issues that bothers me is community action and how we define it and how we get to it. And I see you sort of approach things very pragmatically and in terms of just getting to people. It was raised earlier that people were not interested in buying energy efficient homes, for example, because they were too expensive. But it feels like there's a bit of a gap there in terms of understanding long-term gains and just in general, like reaching out to people. That's what we really have to do. And it's a massive job. We've got 1 million people. I appreciate you just had that meeting with people in Alta Vista, very practical. And that's the kind of thing that people want to know about because it affects their bottom line, their homes. What other things would you see as something we can initiate to do along that line of just getting to people that this is very practical stuff that we should be doing right off the bat?
Thank you for the question. I think that in our climate communications, both for NGOs like ourselves and for the city, we need to unpack it to these practical, relevant, relatable things, right? And then we need to figure out how do we make it more convenient for people to have a better solution and better outcomes, right? So when we're thinking about the green bins, for example, right, and the multi-unit residential buildings, how do we have better public engagement so that, you know, people will work with that system better? How is it that we can help maybe the building owners do retrofits so that the green bin and the organic waste can fit into their waste management solution, right? So there's quite a lot of practical things. And if you look at the climate change master plan, right, it's sort of like a system of Russian dolls where you have the big master plan and then that unpacks to the 8 recommendations, and then energy evolution unpacks to 20 subsectors of intervention. And so you have to kind of like really do your homework. But after about 3-4 steps, you get to these very practical things that are of concern to our residents. And that can be the basement flooding, it can be the green bin, it can be the transportation, having a working public transit, having safe, active transportation, having options there. And I think that the adaptation and risk area, we have critical infrastructures like our drinking water, for example, right? And we know that Ottawa gets those of us who get piped drinking water, we get it from the river, right? And there's a drinking water intake and plant there at the river. So if the river starts flooding again, related to climate impact, we are expecting that. Have we hardened that infrastructure? Are we prepared for that? Or are we going to have some kind of devastating disaster crisis where we have to truck drinking water to the million residents? So it's practical things like that that we can think through and that we can prepare for. And that if we don't do our homework, there's going to be a price to pay. I think I'll stop there, but there could be so many different examples. Actually, I'll say one last thing on the high performance development standard and building better. Some of those solutions are to do with financial intermediation, and Councillor Hill actually knows this very well. And he has introduced a motion to look at this. The problem is that home buyers, especially younger ones, I guess, they look at the purchase price and they don't look at the life cycle operating costs of the house that they're buying. So if there could be like a second mortgage that says, hey, if you're willing to buy a greenhouse, this will spread your operating costs over time, and we're going to help you with that front end expense. So those kinds of financial interventions is something that a city can help its residents that will then result in net benefits. So some of it is engaging with individuals at community level, and other parts of the solution have to do with the financial heft of the city, which can be used to help citizens.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Angela. Our next delegation is Joan Freeman. You have 5 minutes whenever you're ready.
Good morning. Thank you for this. It's been a great discussion and really interesting, and I thank you all for the attention you're putting towards it. I'm part of C3. We're a small group that thinks quite a lot about climate issues and what to do about them in action, and we've been trying to support the city among other groups. In our group, we sent you a written submission on Friday, and I'm appearing here simply because you may have questions. It came in, you don't have much time to read it. It's over the weekend, and this is an age of misinformation, and we certainly don't want to cause more. We want our messages to be clear and understood. I just want to say at the outset that we support the recommendations of the Auditor General, which basically I interpret to be saying that the city cannot continue its business as usual approach without putting us all at high risk. The time has come for council, the decision makers, to decide and direct the city to move away from its business as usual towards a much more proactive and a bold role in managing climate risks. 3 general points, and then if there's any questions, fine. If not, that's great. First is the number. Now, we talked about this a bit. The $687 million required per year is the annual corporate investment, and this number has been thrown around and miscommunicated a lot. This is the total amount from all sources. Think the federal money for electric buses. The city's part isn't really known, but it's estimated to be no more than a third, so that would be $230 million. That's still a lot, but it's only 4 to 5% of the city budget. It's not easy to find that amount, but I believe if the climate was a priority and thinking about all of the benefits you get from doing it, that there could be reallocations within the budget, the staff, and the way of working that you could come up with this. The second point is that the audit findings and a lot of the city climate plans are a bit like warning lights in a car dashboard. And some of those plans are a bit like roadmaps, but you are the drivers, you decide. And these warning lights are basically telling us that we're in trouble. Ignoring them is putting us at peril. I would say that they've built to the point now where we've got a warning that's saying we have got a serious cancer diagnosis. We do not ignore cancer diagnosis, and I don't think you can ignore this anymore. It's time to stop business as usual and start taking measures to protect us and to put us and to make us healthy. It's not going to be easy turning this big ship around, and it's a big corporation. I think the reorganization is a good start, but it does need formal structures. It does need mandate changes, but more importantly, it needs direction and strong support from the decision makers to allocate the money to direct that this happened and that climate becomes a priority in all decisions, actions, and operations. And it hasn't so far, sadly. There's been a lot of piloting and testing, but we really have to start moving now. And the third is the comments about community involvement in the city leadership role. I'm into analogies this morning. I hope you don't mind, but I'm thinking of the city as a bit like a conductor, and you know, the conductor, until he tells what the music is that you're playing and directs everybody, it's just nothing happens, or it's a horrible mess. And that's the state we're in now. There will be massive investments in a big, if we get people spending money and we tell them how to do it, and it's not going to be easy. But it's really has to happen, and the city has to do it. So those are my main points that I just wanted to say, sort of overarching points of how to think about all of this. I do think that it's important that we all take this seriously, and it's a tough time, but we can figure this out. We've got a lot of support for you to do so. I'll stop there. Any questions? Happy to answer them.
Thank you very much. And yes, Ms. Freeman, we did get your delegation material, all of us. So be assured that we did receive that and read it. Questions, Councillor Devine?
Not so much a question, just Joan, thank you for your letter. I read it with great interest. And I just want to let you know, I will be asking either staff or the AG for an explanation on the discrepancy between the total annual cost for GHG emissions, whether it's 687 million per year to the city or 200. I think that's a good point of discrepancy I'd like to find out, but thank you.
Great. Thank you. And we're there to support you. And I would say 70% of Ottawa from the latest polls are very concerned and there to support you as well. So we'd like some leadership.
Thank you, Mrs. Freeman. Thank you for coming out today. All right, well, that concludes our delegations. So we're going to go to questions to the Office of the Auditor General. Now, I'm going to remind committee members, and let me just repeat that. We're going to go to questions to the Office of the Auditor General. So that means not staff. So focus your questions on the audit, please, and thank you. And
can you take Wilson first? Because I'm always first.
Okay.
Oh.
Councillor Carr, you are up first.
Okay, first of all, thank you very much to the staff for this amazing work, to the Office of the Auditor General. In reviewing the audit and reflecting on our last audit committee meeting where we discussed the audit of affordable housing, it can seem evident almost that the last term we excelled at declaring emergencies to our most pressing crisis, but we had a bit of a failure to operationalize, to deliver measures to mitigate or adapt to these crises. And the reason I draw the parallel with affordable housing is you see that, that was declared in 2019 and then exacerbated by the mental health crisis, by the pandemic, uptick in opioids. And then now we have the crisis in global migration, where we actually have more people seeking shelter than we did when we declared the crisis. It's similar to the climate change, the declaration of the climate change crisis in 2019. Since then, in the approval of the CCMP in 2020, we've experienced tornado in June 2019 in Orleans, and last year we had tornadoes, April 2023 ice storm, August 2023 tornadoes, the derecho, of course, and the massive flooding on August 11th. And so the gap between what's happening and what needs to be done continues to grow. I did find in the audit that the list of failures was failures, or that might be too strong of a word, but was rather astonishing, with 20 projects identified within energy evolution off track, behind on our climate change priorities and targets, city off track in 8 priorities areas, not going to reach our community targets, can't measure progress in a meaningful way as no performance indicators, no metrics established, sufficient data and systems to measure progress are not available. And so it was a bit concerning. I just had a few questions on things that I didn't see mentioned specifically in the audit that I wondered if they arose in the cost of the audit. Was there any look, it talked a little bit about, obviously all these things that are going wrong, but there was no mention of activities that the city is doing that hampers progress. For example, we've needed to cut back on our transit budget. Was this something that was looked at when you looked at overall the progress in the climate change master plan, to look at activities that were going on within the city that were not helping achieve the climate change targets? If that question makes sense? Like, what are we not doing, or what are we doing that's taking us backwards?
Thank you for the question, Councillor, and through the chair. I would say that, from our scope, because as Madame Goujon said, our scope really focused on the foundation of the portfolio and the program. However, that being said, I think when we looked at, and so we didn't go down to, let's say, specific, the individual priorities, the individual activities, partially because it was very early days in terms of maturity. But I think if you're to answer your question in terms of hampering, some of the structural things that we did look at, would be a hamper if that's why we did bring them up. So whether we're talking about the accountabilities or the governance or even the strategic direction. So from a foundational component, absolutely, those things do cause challenges. And again, until those things get ironed out, there's the risk of potential inefficiencies or not really tracking towards what the stated outcomes are.
Okay, thank you for that. Another thing in the audit that, you looked at the resourcing, you looked at the fact that we haven't enough financial, that some of the resources are temporary. When you looked at the human resources across the organization at all, did the issue of training come into play at all? Because with respect to staff knowing about the importance of climate change, was that a gap at all? Things that they could be embedding when developing their own recommendations in their day-to-day work. We started to put that sort of information in the budget, but were staff well aware of climate change and the importance of this organizational wide?
Thank you for the question. While our work wouldn't have gone to in terms of like a full scope, does the city broadly understand climate change, but obviously we did certainly talk to those who were actually charged informally or formally with the responsibilities for elements of climate change. And we didn't flag anything that people were not aware of. They had the tools they needed to do their responsibilities. But we obviously acknowledge and certainly from a best practices perspective, we do recognize the challenge and have recognized the challenge that this is such a moving, this industry is moving so fast that keeping up with it is a challenge. And even the idea of trying to figure out training isn't even all that easy to grasp. So while we didn't specifically target that was some of the work that we did and things we identified.
Thanks. And I take your point about the industry moving too fast. Like I remember long before I was on, not long before, but only maybe 5 or 6 years ago, there was concern about investing in e-buses, and now you can't even buy diesel buses, right? So, I mean, it's the only way forward. So, but in terms of moving too fast, in the report, in your audit, you talked about how activities of other governments are out of scope, but then you acknowledged, I think it was in recommendation 7, about the need to get data from federal and provincial. I think you heard my question to Angela Keller-Herzog about coordination among federal and provincial governments. And it's something when we talk about the high performance development standards, which was mentioned in the audit, that's something that has gotten off track. I think the majority of people around the table want to see it implemented, but again, some of the particulars with respect to building code, for example, the province is going to come out with something. Now we know Canada's working on a national harmonized building code. Did you see any opportunity? And it was slightly out of scope, but about that lack of coordination between other levels of government hampering progress at all?
Thank you for the question. I think from the work that we did, we certainly saw that as a challenge, although again, appreciate that a lot of it is outside of the scope of the city. But obviously, we did recognize that both staff and council participate on many different working groups and committees and have one-on-one direct relationships with other levels of government that allow for some of that coordination and some of that activity. So while we acknowledge it, that was as far as I think the work that we did took us. I don't know if Thank you.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much. There's lots of people with their hand up, so I'll take my hand down for now.
All right, I'm going to committee members. Councillor Lowe.
Thanks, Chair. So, when we're looking at actions at the community level, you look at vehicle manufacturers, like my colleague there said, you can't, it's difficult to buy diesel buses now. You look at Volkswagen, they've discontinued a certain model of their car now because they're doing EVs mostly in North America. There were previous incentives to do LED bulbs, and now most of our light bulbs are LEDs. There's retrofits for heat pumps, low impact pavement, all that industry is sort of coming up on its own. So I'm seeing a lot of government catalyzation towards these things, and the market is responding, and therefore consumers are responding. What I don't see in any of that is the municipality being the body that pushes that, right? All these incentives, all these subsidies, these regulations seem to all come from national and subnational governments. So my question is, like, do you think we can improve the clarity of our role by actually perhaps tightening our scope within that, tightening the scope of the report, or maybe even making sure that it's even the correct track we should be on? Like, it's not even, maybe not a question of on or off track in the report, but is that the track we should be on?
Thank you for the question. So our first observation and recommendation absolutely clarified that there appears to be a misalignment between sort of what the plan said and what some of the current direction is relative to community action. I wouldn't want to say that there is no activity. There is absolutely activity going on in the city for incentivizing community action. So I wouldn't want it to say that there isn't. But as our report said, like the time is now to really clarify that and solidify that, such that this money that is spent and the resources that are expended are being put in the direction that's going to be best for the city.
And just to add to that, I think every member here is aware that it's not my office's role to determine council's priorities and make value judgment decisions. So we're not in a position to say you should or you shouldn't. What we can highlight is municipalities are in a position, they have a unique role where they can affect change, where they can be a good partner and make a difference. It's something we see across many municipalities, either in Canada or across the world. And I'm sure our subject matter expert could talk ad nauseum about the different activities that can be done. So we're highlighting those, but that truly is for council and staff to work together to determine what role you see the city playing.
Okay, thanks. I may have done that thing where I asked a staff question to the EG. Okay, I didn't mean to say that the city's done nothing. That's not what I was trying to say, and I apologize if that was misrepresented. But perhaps question for staff then.
All right, thank you, Councillor Kavanaugh.
Thank you very much, Chair. And thank you to the Auditor General and her team for taking this on. It's very much appreciated. And I realize it's a monumental task to take on a climate change master plan. And you've done it well. One of the comments that I think probably jumped out at me, and probably others too, is the fact that anything that was accomplished was done kind of on the side of a desk. And that implies that people are, the staff was overloaded, and they were trying to squeeze this in. Can you elaborate what you meant by that comment?
Thank you for the question through the chair. What we were trying to explain there is really, and it aligns with our observation of lack of formal accountabilities. It's recognized that the city has work to do. There's obviously targets and outcomes, but without the formal accountabilities and responsibilities, people weren't doing it because it was their job to work on it. Outside of, I should say, there was obviously at the time of our audit, there was a climate change team, but outside that, out in the departments, while there were things that were activities that were taken on, it was mostly taken on, as we understood, from just because they knew it was the right thing to do, and their part of the organization was in the best place to do it. So less about the formal responsibilities and accountabilities, and more because it was the right thing to do. And that was what we meant by this on the side of the desk. Appreciate that lots of activities that are happening across the city are like that, but this was the focus of this one.
No, I appreciate that. In terms of the timelines, you talked about that, and obviously they were not met. How were they unrealistic in your opinion?
Counselor, just a clarification, do you mean the timelines related to implementing, like the targets?
Yes.
I guess that, I don't think that would be the role of our office to say that. We do recognize that there are short and medium and long-term goals relative to emission reduction. And, you know, at the moment, as far as we understand, the short-term management's on track and for the corporate, but not for the community. So I don't think at this point I'd feel comfortable commenting on that.
Okay, sorry about that. As soon as I said opinion, I realized now I can't say that. Anyway, but one thing I wanted to ask about was you used the example of the city of Toronto and the implementation dates for greenhouse gas emission limits and their green standards. And it sounds like a great model for Ottawa. Did you look at any other cities and major cities as well?
Thank you for the question through the chair. We did do a benchmarking exercise through this audit, and we were looking at actually quite a number of cities, both within Ontario and Canada. And our subject matter expert, who was sitting beside me, conducted that. And where we wanted to highlight some of the information, we have lots of information, obviously, in our working papers, but we highlighted some of those in our report. But we definitely benchmarked to other cities, Halifax, Vancouver, obviously Toronto, and Montreal, and I believe Edmonton. Thank you.
Is there kind of a chart that shows who's doing the best, or?
We didn't put in our report, but we tried to highlight key pieces of information in our report that we wanted to flag.
Okay, it would be good to know that. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Vice Chair Brown.
Thank you, Chair, and Councillor Kavanaugh touched on a few points that I was hoping to. Appreciate the audit and very challenging given the scope and I think the sensitivity around it. In terms of the benchmarking and the scans you did of other municipalities, and I don't know who I should best direct this question to, were there key either similarities or dissimilarities that informed some of the recommendations that came out in your audit report when you looked at those other municipalities and the city?
Thank you for the question. I would say that obviously there was similarities in that for the most part, most of the municipalities that we looked at are lagging behind in terms of adaptation, in terms of, you know, this is a newer, everyone's reacting right now. So I think there's much more focus on community emissions, emissions in general. So that was one trend that was very similar, but we certainly did see other municipalities that were ahead in certain elements of their program. You know, we highlighted the Toronto with the green. We've talked about, I believe in the report, Halifax with their EV chargers. So we did try to highlight that there are definitely some municipalities that are ahead in certain elements of their program.
Thank you very much. And we heard a list of the municipalities, recognize most of the names just from other comparisons that have been undertaken by both your office and other departments when we look at programs and services. And Ottawa is very different. You know, it's a city, but we have a very large rural component. And I know sometimes that plays a part in terms of how we implement different policies and how they impact residents across the city of Ottawa. When we're looking at, or when your office reviewed some of the stated goals of the climate change master plans and all of the different reports and policies that have come in underneath that, were there any specific points or specific policies in other cities that would be easily transferable to the city of Ottawa that we could implement? Because I think one of the challenges with the climate change master plan and the energy evolution plan, and I think it's on page 5 of your report or a little before that, 95% of much of what we would like to do in this city, we as council don't have direct control over. So we have to rely on the goodwill and activities of other individuals, third parties, and other levels of government. So are there any key points that we would be able to port over so we could accomplish some of our stated goals and not reinvent the wheel?
Thank you for the question. I hope I don't sound like a broken record. I think there certainly are, but I would hate to put easily transferable because I know there's costs and impacts of anything. So even if, I know our report does highlight the high performance development standards, and again, we've referenced Toronto in terms of their progress there. But I appreciate that it's not easy, and there's other implications. So while that might be seen as a policy, and I know that's one that council is obviously looking at, I wouldn't want to just say that it's easy to implement. So that would be one that I would flag. I don't know if Claire, if you would flag anything else.
Through the chair, and thanks for having me. There's nothing in particular I would flag, more so to say that the same sort of policy applications, both on the community and corporate level, would be consistent across municipalities. How you would tailor it would be after your assessment. So you would do a mitigation assessment and an adaptation assessment to identify your top impacts and then design your programs accordingly. And that's of course where your key performance measures come from as well. So using on the community side policy, like you said, the official plan, as well as other key tools, bylaws, zoning, those are all consistent tools, and the design standard is a great example of those. On the corporate side of things, your facilities operate in much the same way. You have the same operations fleet and buildings, and the energy systems would also be applicable across municipalities. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, I guess easily is a very subjective term depending on what we're talking about. My last question, and more for a clarification so we can have an informed discussion with staff next. All of the data, the financial information, everything contained in your audit report was information that you received from staff, correct?
Chair, that is correct. So figures were either taken from the climate change master plan or the most recent staff progress report that was presented last year to committee and council.
Thank you very much, and great work on the audit. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vice Chair. Councillor Hill.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Take that as no.
Sorry about that, comms problems. Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you very much for to the audit team for this extremely important and complicated audit on a topic that we need to talk about. On page 10, you noted that the 23 to 26 term of council environmental priority does not reference community emissions and community related actions. However, we do have a term of council priority to make Ottawa a city that has affordable housing and is more livable for all. When reviewing how tools like the high performance development standards impacted climate emissions in other municipalities, did you also identify how these higher standards impacted on the costs of housing in those cities?
Chair, thank you very much for the question, Councillor. I think I'm going to reiterate one piece that I just mentioned. Councillor Hill, I think you were absent. It's important to know that my office can't comment on council priorities in the sense of I can't state one is more important than the other. So just I want to preface that with how we answer this question. I can't state the council should put more money into climate change versus affordable housing on one over the other. So I just want to carefully answer that question, and I'll get Deputy Auditor General Gorenstein to add to that.
Just to clarify my question, so I'm not asking for an opinion on that. I'm simply asking if you looked at the impact on the cost of housing in other cities when looking at the high performance development standards.
Thank you for the question. So we didn't actually dig deep into that particular policy or any other at all. We used it as one particular example of something that has been contemplated, but we aren't recommending in our report one way or another. It was just an example of an activity that a city has done. And obviously it's been contemplated by this one, but a deep dive, I wouldn't want anyone to think that our audit did a deep dive at this particular policy change in terms of cost or anything else.
Okay, thank you. And several of the recommendations spoke to gathering better data and setting clear key performance indicators. Would you attribute the city's disjointed approach to climate change to a desire to take action right away and then figure out how to measure it afterwards?
Thank you for the question. I don't know that I would feel comfortable stating what management or the city's plan was at the time of putting this together. I will acknowledge, though, that as part of our audit, we definitely understand, and this is just a reality of the industry it's in, some of the data points are not easy to obtain. So as much as I think management is looking to provide and to obtain, some of it's either just not available because it doesn't exist, or it's from other levels of government, or again, it's really early in the maturity, not like a total, it's not that there's nothing, but I do want to acknowledge that that in some cases that is a challenge.
Okay, thank you very much, Madam Chair.
All right, Councillor Menard.
Thanks very much, Chair, and thanks again to the audit team for this really helpful work. I noted that the audit said that there's meaningful work going on across the city to advance the city's climate change goals, that projects are ongoing within the climate change and resiliency team and the departments to support emission reduction and early adaptation activities. And you noted that staff are passionate about this priority and believe that the portfolio needs to be a priority. And I give my world for passionate bureaucrats. I took my master's in public administration, and to have passionate people caring about those files is something that is very rare, I find. And it's so important when you have people that care about the files that they work on. And I'm just happy to see that that was recognized here as part of this audit. You made a recommendation around the city's climate team, or I guess you highlighted that the city's climate team is fairly temporary, that 15 of the 24 members are temporary, and that 50% of the funding pays staffing costs. One of the recommendations is that the city explore a permanent resourcing or funding strategy that aligns with the role and the structure of the climate change and resiliency team. I'm wondering if you can just expand upon that. Is it that the temporary nature is perhaps detracting from long-term work, or that the funding sources have been, I guess, we used to fund through the hydro auto dividend surplus, and then we moved to, which was fluctuated year to year. We moved to this $5 million funding. Maybe you could just expand on what you mean by that recommendation.
Thank you for the question, through the chair. Our observation related to the team and the temporary nature certainly flagged risks associated with not being able to, so it's partially the funding and it's partially the temporary nature. It doesn't allow or increases the risk of people coming and going because they're not assured long-term work. So the expertise can go, but just not being able to really plan long-term because again, there wasn't always, up until more recently, assured funding. So it's a little bit of both, but I do recognize that obviously, and part of the management response is that there has been a reorganization. So, so management is certainly working on some of that at the moment.
That's helpful. We are seeing, I guess, a need in the audit for a holistic and realistic list of priority projects to address both mitigation and adaptation concurrently to achieve the city's climate change goals. By that, are you saying that there are some steps that need to be taken to have priority projects within the funding envelope that we have in comparison to other cities? Or is there something else that you're getting at when you make that recommendation around the holistic list of priority projects to address both of those important pieces of climate change goals?
Thank you for the question, through the chair. What we were just highlighting is that up until now, most of the portfolio related to climate change was energy evolution and the priorities that came out of that piece of work. And a lot of work has now gone into the resiliency strategy and the 40 risks that have been identified with that. And what we were seeing was sort of these two parallel tracks going on, looking for similar funding in a broader environment of all other priorities. So all we were wanting to flag is that as here's the time where the resiliency strategy is coming out, and unless it's sort of looked at holistically relative to the frame of the risks overall to the city and the funding envelope for the city, there's the risk associated with nothing actually being achieved as expected.
And I think obviously this is a priority that is a largest existential threat for our city, and in my view needs to be made the priority that it is across the world. in our city as well. So given all the storms and everything that we've been responding to, you made mention that the general manager should define specific quantitative metrics that will be assessed outside of the established greenhouse gas reduction targets to demonstrate progress across the portfolio. The management responses that we got back to the audit were very focused on the reorg, and they focused in just on the strategic initiatives department. That was a concern for me to see that, because I was worried that the priorities that you were referencing in there and the actual action items weren't necessarily being addressed, but just saying that the reorg was going to solve that. I'm wondering, you see management's responses before these go public, what your view was of the management responses in accepting your recommendations, but in indicating that it was just a new kind of department or strategic initiative side that was going to be the catalyst to solve a lot of the issues.
Thank you for the question, to the chair. When we looked at the management responses from our perspective, well, yes, like we acknowledge that there was a reorganization and that there would be a new body looking at the recommendations. Their acknowledgement that they agreed with the recommendations and that they were planning on taking steps with timelines associated with each recommendation was a signal to us that they were taking it seriously. I appreciate that it didn't have a full action plan associated with it, but our perspective was that with this new group, they would be able to focus on those actions. So that's how we took it.
Okay, thank you for that. The maybe a last question for me, Chair, just on the staff side. The audit management responses came back around some of the timing for when they're going to get back on these issues. One of them talked about a proper funding strategy in place by Q4 of 2025. And I'm just wondering, I guess that's not this upcoming budget cycle, it's the next budget cycle. Is that going to be enough to address the problem that you were speaking about, given the complexities and the issues, the large issues, the grave issues, I guess, that we face? Is Q4 2025 a relevant response to agree to what you had mentioned about the lack of a permanent strategy, especially with the new strategic initiatives department already being established now? Is that too long, or is that not something you would normally comment on?
Thank you for the question, Councillor. Chair, while ideally speaking, we would like a sooner implementation date, we have to take into consideration that there are other recommendations that need to be actioned or at least contemplated before determining appropriate recommendations from a funding perspective. So we have to take that into consideration, that there are steps they have to take before bringing forward to council a potential revised budget to this particular area. So knowing that staff are working on budget 2025 right now, I think it would be pretty difficult for them to incorporate it. That being said, and this would be for management to comment on, there's never anything prohibiting staff from bringing, changes to a budget down the road. So if that's something that council is seeking, I think that would be up to staff to comment further on.
Okay, thanks again for your audit. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Devine.
Thank you, Chair. I'll try to frame my questions around what I believe the AG's office stated was your objective in performing this audit, which was, quote, to provide reasonable assurances that the city has appropriate plans, strategies, and tools in place to support the achievement of the city's climate change targets and priority actions. And so I think I'm going to be trying to ask questions of Ms. Bennett, but Claire, just so I understand, can you describe your role in this? You are the environmental expert here.
Through the chair, climate change expert, external expert assisting, yes.
Brilliant, thank you. My first question, so I'll ask questions to Claire, and if Claire is not the person to answer the question, you'll let me know, I'm sure. Based on one of the delegations earlier, Mr. Saravanamatu, who spoke about whether or not the city should play a role of a caretaker, taking care of its own assets, or of a regional leader, taking more of an active response, an active role in galvanizing community action. If it is true that 95% of our emissions come from community action, and if our goal is to provide appropriate measures in place for us to collectively lower those, would you agree with the delegates' position that if the city does not take effective community action, that we are going to be just not getting close enough to achieving our targets?
I'll start by answering that question, Chair. I want to reiterate that my office cannot determine what role the council as a whole must play. It's for council to determine its priorities and to establish. But that being said, what Claire can do is perhaps demonstrate how a municipality can assist from that perspective when she's
Well,
seen
then
with
can I
other
ask you more?
municipalities.
Then what? I'll reframe the question. If as a collective body, we are 1 to 1.4 million people over the next 30 years, and if as a collective body of citizens, if the community as a whole does not take effective action in mitigating its role in this, if individual residents do not take strong collective action, are we going to achieve our targets?
Through the chair, I can speak to the fact of what's been publicly committed. So the city of Ottawa has committed publicly and is following protocol in terms of both community and corporate emissions, and other municipalities are tackling both community and corporate emissions. And there are protocols and frameworks guiding how that happens, including greenhouse gas accounting protocols to calculate your emissions. On the corporate side, your direct emissions would be quite simple to calculate, as we heard from one of the delegations. And it does take all individuals and levels of government to solve this global challenge, because it is obviously global.
Thank you. In the context of what is consistently framed as a climate emergency, we heard from one of the members of the committee earlier that he would be advocating more for that the city take a measured approach as opposed to a bolder, quicker approach. Is it fair to say that taking a more measured approach as compared to a more urgent approach might put us sooner and further into harm's way?
Thank you for the question. Again, I don't believe that that would be the role of our office to say like doing it faster, slower, more money. What we're trying to point out is that there's some foundational gaps in terms of achieving the goals as set out right now.
All right. There's reference to using the term of council priorities document as a reference guide as opposed to the OP. I heard one person mention, can you speak to whether the reduction of GHG emissions would indeed fit within the term of council's framework of building a green and resilient city? Does that goal to build a green and resilient city, can that language encompass targets of GHG reductions?
Chair, yes, I would state that it does. I think what we were highlighting is that the current council priority does not have a link back to the community action piece.
All right. This is not so much a yes or no question. Can you speak, whether to Claire or to AG office, how detrimental is it for the city to effectively work towards GHG emission targets without access to annual data, let alone having access to any new data since 2020? How effectively can we monitor without that data?
Chair, I think that's partially where our finding comes from, and where our recommendation is as members of council, I'm not sure how you can make informed decisions if you do not have timely information brought to you. So that is where our recommendation is really aiming towards, is to ensure that council is armed with as much information as possible to make the best decisions.
Thank you. In one of your recommendations, recommendation 6, the language in your recommendation was that the city should explore permanent resourcing and funding strategy that aligns with the role and structure of the climate change resiliency team going forward. And you used the language permanent. The response from management was that it agreed with the recommendation, but that it said it will explore establishing a sustainable funding source. So you make the recommendation for language permanent. Management's response is sustainable, yet they agree with the recommendation. Does the AG have any opinion on whether that discrepancy in language in response is suggestive that management does in fact accept and will agree to your recommendation?
Chair, I believe management is in agreement with our recommendation. I think, and I'll let management add to that when it comes to their point. What they mean by sustainable is permanent, as well as taking into consideration the very scarce resources that the city has.
Of course. On that issue of, somebody raised the question, and this I think has to be a question for staff, but somebody raised the question of, in your report, you point to $687 million annual corporate investment. One of the delegates said, sorry, the city's only responsible for 1/3 of that. So one of those has got to be true, and that's a huge gap in annual corporate investment. Do you have anything to say about that perceived discrepancy?
Chair, as I responded to Vice Chair Brown, those figures are specifically figures that we're quoting from staff report. So those are not audited figures. So I couldn't speak to the accuracy or inaccuracy of them.
Thank you. And my last question, Chair. Earlier, I was talking about how AG did seem to agree with or have some kind of enthusiasm about one of the delegates' recommendation for the resuscitation of public stakeholder groups. Do you know, are there ever further further recommendations that come from you? And might the AG's office be considering making a sub-recommendation of something as specific as a stakeholder engagement group?
Thank you for the question, and through you, Chair. In terms of stakeholder engagement, I think and I did hear some conversation and questions about it with the delegations. So that was definitely part of the work that we did. And in fairness, because one of the priority activities as part of the Climate Change Master Plan is to review and update the governance, we did foundational work on that with this in terms of our audit, and recognize that this was actually a work in progress. So the governance structure, including that stakeholder engagement, is something that they're working on, and recognizing that those committees that were named as part of the delegations are not currently in place, but that staff is working on trying to determine what is the best structure, because they're pros and cons of every committee and stakeholder engagement. So they are working on that, hence why we don't specifically have a recommendation, because that is actually a work in progress. But at the moment, to answer your direct question, we do not have any plan to make any additional recommendations. However, we always have the opportunity when we do follow-up work to recommend something back to management if the risk hasn't been addressed.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Kitts.
Thank you, Chair. Just one quick question from me. I know that the recommendation was the operational change to the new strategic initiatives department, which has been done. But I'm just wondering, does the Tiger team still have a function?
Chair, so just to clarify, we do not make any sort of recommendation with regards to a reorganization. So this would have been a management decision separate from our audit. They may have utilized some of information from our audit. So where we focused from a resourcing perspective was talking about that permanent structure. With regards to the Tiger team, I do believe there is still a role to play from that overarching strategic direction internally. I think that was the piece that we were looking to see that we weren't seeing them play. They were more of an information receiving body as opposed to helping give direction as to, where resources should be spent and whether or not we were attacking the right elements.
And that kind of strategic direction from the Tiger team is a city best practice?
That's a good question. I'm going to ask our subject matter expert if this is something she sees frequently.
Through the chair, best practice is to have ultimate accountability at the highest levels, so CAO levels of any corporate program, and there would be guiding committees made up of stakeholders. In this case, that's internal stakeholders, and they would be helping to provide recommendations and review. There should be senior manager and above level participation on those. But key functions are the CAO, executive, and management level functions designated for sustainability. They would help review. They wouldn't necessarily be decision makers.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so I see no further questions to the Office of the Auditor General. I will just say, just as a general comment from me, performance audits are great audits because you're asking, did you do what you said you were going to do? And I think in every performance audit, the answer usually is no. I mean, it'd be very rare, I think, to have a performance audit where it's yes, you did absolutely everything you've ever meant to do. So there will always be some element of no. I think that's what we've heard here. But the bigger question, I think, for us, I mean, we say thank you very much for this audit. The bigger question is to staff to say, okay, now that you see where the challenges are, what are you going to do about it? And that will be the basis of our questions coming to staff right now. So questions to staff. Councillor Kitts, you're going up first, or your hand is left from the other one? No?
No, let it go.
Councillor Carr.
Okay, thanks very much. And I will note that Mr. McDonald is relatively new to his job, so may not have all the answers that we're looking for today. I guess the first question, and it's something that came up in our discussions today, you've got a time frame of basically running up to 2026 to implement all of those recommendations that were made in the Auditor General's this report. During this time, can you describe a little bit what you will continue to work on with respect to the climate change master plan, energy evolution, what work will be ongoing, and also, as you're working to prioritize the CCMP, the funding of $5 million around the Hill motion, if you can describe if there would still be any community work going on during that time. So I kind of threw two questions. Well, I only get a few questions with you, so I got to make them big.
So Chair, as was noted by the Auditor General, meaningful work continues to progress, and that work will continue while we take a look at some of these more fundamental questions around how we're organized, how we're prioritized, and how we'll be moving forward from a governance perspective in the future. And so what we'll want to do is, as we continue with this existing work, is have a lens to where we'll be going in the future, the recommendations that come to the audit, how that work aligns, where there are any potential gaps. Is the information that we need to assess success available? How have we established a governance for those pieces? Do we have the ability to report? How does it align with some of the things that council has asked us to bring forward? And so that will all progress while we're looking at the more substantive questions around how the organization will continue to move forward into the future.
Okay, thanks. So for example, like one thing that's often discussed is the high performance development standards. It was over a year ago that they were put on hold. I think at the time, even the mayor said that he does support them. There has been, some of them are being implemented already. For example, like the solid waste in the buildings, for example. We need to get an understanding what the province and the feds are doing on building code, but like, do you see an opportunity during that time, if you get direction from council, to revisit those standards and perhaps move forward with implementation? Like, that's not off the table during all of this work, correct?
Sure, that's correct. It is not off the table. There was a great deal of uncertainty regarding the direction the province was going to be going leading up to the release of the new building code. Now that that has been released, we're in a position to bring forward a strategy related to high performance development standards.
Okay, sorry, so just to clarify, will you be bringing forward that strategy on HBDS as part of this package, or if council wanted it accelerated, we could do that through a motion or whatever else, right? Or
I'd be pleased to take any direction council wants to give.
Okay, perfect. I asked a question to the Auditor General that perhaps was better directed with staff in terms of, in the context of this work, will you be in advancing the climate change master plan goals and our council goals and strategic priorities? Will you be having a lens at all looking at work that the city is doing that's running contrary to the goals of the CCMP?
So Chair, our objective is that we're moving forward on our broader climate change objectives. If there are things that we are doing that is holding us back, that'll be something I will look at.
Okay, I'll maybe ask you one more and then give you a break. It's with, I just wanted to clarify from the first questions with respect to the community work and whether or not, like, you know, I said it before, like the city is in a very unique position to take action with our responsibility for solid waste, transit, parks, zoning. That's a big one. And the community piece that it's 95%. You don't see anything in the Hill motion where we're asking that $5 million to be prioritized that would prevent us from continuing to move forward on those community objectives, or you do. Like, I'm just wondering if, with the fact that the recommendations in the AG report they've got a long timeline. And if this is something where direction is needed sooner rather than later, like, do you see yourself having the continued ability to implement community strategies, or do you feel that it's off the table in terms of that motion and what's happened there?
So Chair, Council has set very ambitious targets that cannot be achieved without a community perspective. And so we continue to look at how do we balance all of our priorities to make sure that we're moving forward and addressing all of the targets that Council has set for us.
Okay, I'll sneak one more in because I've been really well behaved this meeting. Do you feel that you have adequate resources to carry out the work on climate change as well as the recommendations in the AG report?
Chair, this is something that we'll be looking at in response to the recommendation.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Vice Chair Brown.
Thank you very much, Chair. And Will, nice to see you in the chair. My first question relates down to the first recommendation, and in management's response, it talks about clarifying the role of council in the city in terms of this plan and how we move forward. What does that actually mean? What kind of conversations are you having with the senior management and other city departments in clarifying the role that we can take?
So Chair, I'd say step one in clarifying the role was the creation of this service area and the establishment of a point of accountability for the achievement of our objectives. In responding to the recommendation, we'll need to be looking at what is the most appropriate governance structure for the climate change service area and how best we can move forward to achieve our objectives. And so, Chair, I think it's a little premature to be able to say exactly what that plan will be because it will be informed by the work that we undertake in response to the audit recommendation.
Thank you very much. And in the second management response, it talks about coming up with a realistic list of priorities that we can take meaningful action on. And I think between clarifying our role and coming up with a realistic priority list, it highlights the gap that the current approved council strategy shows, that there's that gap. And so when we're coming up with a realistic list of priorities, what does that entail?
So Chair, you're correct. The achievement of the objectives that council has set go beyond what the city can do on its own. And so what we'll need to be assessing is how can we derive the greatest impact by best utilizing the limited resources, both financial and human resources that exist at the city. What are the ways that we can work with other levels of government or with the community to address those gaps? And what is left over when we look at a realistic prioritization list so that we can make decisions around prioritization or timelines. And so these will all be things that are informed by each other, and they will be built on each other as we bring forward iterative approaches to how we'll address this. Leading out to 2050, these are very long-term and ambitious targets.
Thank you very much. And I'll bounce off the financial component of your response. And Cyril's here, I believe. Cyril, in I think it was page 5 of the audit report, there's a little green bubble that indicates that the city is falling short of its annual commitment to meet the different priorities of this plan at pegged about $678 million. What would that look like as a tax increase if we had to raise those funds for the 2025 budget so we can meet that annual contribution requirement?
Through the chair, so approximately 1% is about 20 million. So call it 34%. 35% will be what will be required to fund that.
So if it's the will of council, we either need to find $687 million of savings and efficiencies and sacrifice other programs and service, or ask the taxpayer to contribute another 34% so we can meet the goals and targets outlined in the climate change master plan.
Chair, I mean, the simple answer would be yes, but don't lose sight of what we've done in the last 2 budget cycles where we layered in the climate change lens to our budget. In the 2024 budget, we have $278 million contributed from the overall $1.2 billion capital program. So in 2024, that's just shy of 25% of our total $1.2 billion capital program is allocated to projects where there's a moderate or a high impact to climate change projects or criteria. So I think it's important to kind of reference that. The challenge that we have in working with Mr. McDonald going forward in the new alignment, new department is we are all doing climate change in different capacities in all of our service areas. When I look at strictly finance, we've layered in the task force on climate and financial disclosures in our annual reports. When I look at my colleague to the right of me, a lot of our projects are now being, that integration of the climate change lens into our budget. Everyone's thinking that way. So we've been doing a lot of things in parallel. Now that work is now going to see where those parallels come together to get more effective on the outcomes.
Thank you very much for that, and I'll jump on a few of those comments. I think any conversation that goes forward, Madam Chair, about the city not doing enough, it's not completely accurate, and I would say it's almost disingenuous because we are doing quite a bit. And through the information staff provided to the OAG, and it's been contained in this report, I'll read right off the sheet here so I don't get it wrong. We're looking at a $52 million investment in 2023, and then a $278 million investment that Cyril just spoke about in the 2024 budget. That's a 434% increase. So the city is doing quite a bit. And I would say that most of what we do, although we try to capture, is not being captured. And we see that outlined in the report. So we do need better metrics so we can have all of the information available to us, as the Auditor General said, so we can make informed decisions. I would say that there are many priorities in this city, and where they overlap, it's always great to be able to make those efficiencies and move forward. But if we're talking about fulfilling the plan as approved in 2020, we're going to have to make some pretty difficult decisions around the council table as to what we want to cut so we can fund this plan. And I think that's going to be a very tough conversation, and that's always reserved for the budget. So I won't go on there too long. And because I'm only allowed to poke fun at myself, I always joke with everyone that knows me, my life's goal is to grow to be 6 feet tall. And that I know is an unrealistic goal. Just like I think there are many aspects to the plan as approved that are unrealistic. And so I'm looking forward to seeing what a realistic list of priorities that we can action ourselves is going to look like. If 95% of the actions that have to be taken are not within our direct control, I think that shows that perhaps the previous council's eyes were a little bigger than their stomachs. I think this is our opportunity to take some targeted action to make improvements where we can and within where it is within our jurisdiction. And it's okay to say that we can't do everything, but let's find out what we can do and do it well. Thank you very much, Madam Chair.
Well said. Thank you, Vice Chair Brown. Councillor Hill.
Thank you very much. I want to start by reading the first couple paragraphs from a CBC article that came out about 3 or 4 days ago about a similar federal program. It's entitled "Ottawa Abolishes Green Fund in Response to a Scathing Auditor General Report." The federal government is axing a $1 billion green fund in response to a report by the Auditor General that pointed to significant lapses in its handling of the federal funding. According to Auditor General Karen Hogan, Sustainable Development Technology Canada, SDTC, violated its conflict of interest policies 90 times, awarded $59 million to 10 projects that were not eligible, and frequently overstated the environmental benefits of its projects. And this is the concern that I have with the pace that we put to this programming. I don't think it's in question that we want to evolve and improve our environmental goals and aspirations. And I also don't think that we're fighting the issue of energy transformation to electrification. I think the issue is, are we thinking through the second and third order effects, whether they be to budgetary issues, whether it be to safety and fire issues when we look at the expansive and exponential growth of battery usage, or whether it be other aspects of potential downside risk to our environment portfolio. And one of the big ones, and I mentioned it when we talked to when we had our last Environment Committee meeting, was our landfilling of batteries and hazardous material that will skyrocket as we move forward in this program. And that's not to say I am not supportive of moving forward. I'm supportive of moving forward in such a way that we have a balanced and measured approach. And so I use that as my start state, I suppose, for some of the questions that I have asked some of our delegates, but also to staff as well. So I note that the Auditor General's report identified that we set $278 million in the 24 budget for capital initiatives to reduce GHG emissions in Ottawa. And that number includes the battery electric bus program, the ROPEC electrical reliability project, and infrastructure rehabilitations projects. How are you going to measure the impact of light rail, or transportation projects that encourage more environmentally friendly resident behavior in emissions data and reductions objectives?
So Chair, one of the recommendations is that we develop an approach related to measurement and verification and reporting. And so this is a key focus for us. One of the things that we've been doing and have been focused on through these initial weeks following the creation of the service area is understanding what our operating model is. And one of a key area of focus for us will be establishing an area within the team and functions related to reporting, governance, measurement, and verification so that we can speak to those elements as the program moves forward.
Okay, and the climate change master plan was introduced in 2020. We're still working to complete the GHG surveys that was identified by some of our delegates for 21-22. Why has identifying and then gathering clear data on the city's emissions proven to be such a problem?
So Chair, I can't speak to the historical challenges, but we will be bringing forward our GHG inventories. They are underway. I recognize that this is incredibly important for council to make informed decisions, so this remains a priority for us.
I noted that a number of my colleagues and delegates as well spoke to the commitment to consult with council, but also other key stakeholders. What's your approach on how you're going to address those consultations, or do you have one at this point?
So Chair, this will be informed by our review of governance. I agree that stakeholder engagement is incredibly important. And so this will be an element that we'll be looking at. We'll want to understand best practices and what will be the most effective way for us to deliver on our portfolio.
Okay, I understand, we talk regularly about the energy efficiency of buildings and structures and what that means in terms of legacy buildings and retrofits versus new buildings and building codes, high performance development standards and such, involving the significant investments and requiring third-party partners to complete retrofit work, which is an effective corporate action that the city can take to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions footprint. Can you speak to some of the challenges that these projects will undertake and the work that you're going to do to get the most effective financial deal for taxpayers when we look at retrofitting and managing our corporate portfolio of building structures?
I'm sorry, Chair, can you repeat the question? Is it focused on our corporate portfolio?
Yeah.
Or is it related to the high performance development standards?
Yeah, corporate portfolio building standards.
So Chair, this continues to be a priority for us. The city's been making a number of investments related to addressing emissions within our corporate portfolio. We continue to move forward with that. One of the teams that has now come under the new climate change and resiliency service area was the former building engineering and energy management team from our CFS, so that we can provide a more holistic corporate-wide perspective to how we'll address these challenges.
Okay, and to connect, I guess, to that, our subsidiary Hydro Ottawa has a ton of expertise in terms of retrofit and such. I'm assuming that you're going to be working closely with them as a stakeholder on this file. And I would ask, is there scope to perhaps even have a representative from Hydro Ottawa available at future committee meetings in order to engage with them on specific issues of retrofit, of support to the broad environment portfolio when we're looking at this issue? Because I think there's a lot that they could offer us.
Chair, Hydro Ottawa continues to be a strategic partner to us. We meet with them regularly, and where there is expertise and that they can add to move us forward, I'm certainly open to that.
I'll close by talking about green financing. I know that was mentioned by a delegate. I am interested to see how we can move forward with our finance industry partners. I do believe that this is broader than a municipal issue, but I think, as was mentioned prior, do we want to be leaders or caretakers? I think this is a place where we can advocate and we can work with leaders in the financial industry to perhaps set the conditions for something that could be rolled out broader than simply Ottawa. But I think that there is space whereby the private sector, specifically the finance industry, but probably working collaboratively with the construction industry, with the three levels of government, can come together in a place where there is an incentive for greenfield developments to have green premiums that will not be cost prohibitive at the outset to new buyers. So I'm hopeful that that's a part of your your continued portfolio moving forward and that that's not in a stalled state.
Chair, we'll continue to work with our partners in finance and corporate services on how best to achieve our objectives.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Councillor Kavanaugh.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to staff. I wanted to ask about metrics. Of course, that is an important recommendation. It was raised that it's possible to measure not just costs, because everybody can see what costs are, but also benefits. And I just want to ask if that can be considered. This was raised by a delegation, Neil Saravanamatu, and I just wanted comments on if we can do that as a target to show that not only does these do changes, will they have an initial cost, but the amounts that save.
So Chair, what we'll have to do as part of assessing all of our projects is understanding what those key success measures are. In some cases, it'll be emission reductions, and others it'll be a financial return on investment. But we'll need to understand how we're assessing, how we're moving forward on those pieces, and so that we can continue to be able to determine whether we've correctly prioritized the work we're undertaking.
Okay, I think that would be helpful I think we get caught up in the cost, but of course there is a huge cost to not doing anything at all. And we have to do our bit, and it's been argued about what percentage of the world our bit is, but it also has been pointed out, air pollution is here and it's actually affecting our population and cancer, everything. So I appreciate all that we can do to show that we're doing something. In terms of community action, which is something that came up, what are we defining that as a city?
So Chair, community engagement is incredibly important. As we noted, the city will not be successful in achieving our targets without a community perspective. It helps us build credibility, it helps us catalyze action. And so we'll need to assess the best approach to delivering, good, robust community engagement and successful community-wide emission reductions in order to move forward with these very ambitious objectives that the city has set. And as noted as the audit, that needs to be balanced across all of our various portfolios and all of our various priorities to make sure that we are actually able to achieve what we're setting out to do.
I think timelines are something that is always difficult. No matter what kind of project we do as a city, it's impossible to just pinpoint an exact time. But obviously, they're targets. And I just want to know, going forward, are we adjusting our timelines? Are I mean, clearly we're not hitting them right now. So what is happening on that score?
So Chair, one of the recommendations is that we would do a refresh of the priority projects, and we would assess how we're advancing towards these pieces. So I think it's premature to say that we would be changing any of those timelines. Council established those timelines, and so there's no intent to change those.
Okay. In terms of examples out there that we can follow, Toronto was raised, City of Toronto, and there's probably other municipalities. Are we taking a good look at what they're doing? And obviously the HPDS has already been mentioned, and that seems to be very effective. What else can we learn from other cities? And what are we looking at?
Yes, Chair, we continue to learn from all of our other municipalities across the city. If there are things that they're doing that we can learn lessons from to help us be more successful, we will certainly take note of that.
Okay, is there anything right now that is being looked at in terms of examples?
Chair, I'm not in a position to speak to specific examples at this point, but I'd be happy to follow up with the councillor.
Okay, I appreciate that. No, I appreciate overall. The other thing that was mentioned was about Hydro Ottawa and the partnership, and I appreciate your response on that, but I just wanted to say out loud that that is very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Kavanaugh. Councillor Kitts.
Thank you, Vice Chair. Kind of building off Councillor Kavanaugh's questions, really happy to see recommendation 7 around metrics and reporting. I think without KPIs. We really lack direction. So I am looking forward to seeing that governance framework come back in 2025. I know that the reorg happened fairly recently, but I was wondering if you could unpack or shed some light a little bit on how you see that work being done, like how the performance indicators are going to be identified and defined.
So Chair, the first step is we need to understand what performance indicators exist and what data we have available to us. If the data is not yet available, what are those other means by which we'll assess the success of the initiative we're undertaking? And so I think each one is looked at on a case-by-case basis specific to what the undertaking is and what we're trying to achieve.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. And then are you going to be seeking input from outside the organization, like via consultants or experts, or is it all going to be sort of an in-house exercise?
Chair will likely have to draw on subject matter expertise that may not exist within the city today.
Okay, thank you. That's it for me.
All right, Councillor Menard.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thanks for being here and answering questions. I just wanted to start by asking about some of the responses that came back, and I think we're on the same page, but I assume city management agree that the advice of the Auditor General that we need, that we've established targets and need both mitigation and adaptation as a city. Staff would agree with that. Okay. The city management would also agree, I assume, that we need to be looking at community actions, given that 95% of our emissions are there, and that you couldn't just leave that alone and not touch that and expect to have any chance of meeting any targets the city has set, both in the official plan, the climate change master plan, and a number of supporting documents that both need to be looked at. Is that accurate?
Yes, Chair.
Okay, thanks very much. And I just wanted to, there was a line that was said that 95% of our emissions are community emissions, but these are somehow out of our control. But I just want to, that's not really accurate or true. I mean, the FCM says that approximately 44% of national greenhouse gases are either directly in control of municipal governments or indirectly in control of municipal government. So just to get clarity on the line that like the 95% are out of our control, that's not accurate. We do have some measure or modicum of control over that and can affect those emissions. I would just to say get clarity on.
Yes, Chair, there are activities within the city control that will have an impact on the community actions.
Okay, that's fantastic. And I guess just to keep on this kind of train of thought, the auditor recommends that there's a lack of, I guess, permanent funding in relation to the scope of the mission, and that can be a challenge. That poses a challenge for our city. Is the intent? Will senior leadership look at permanent funding and increases that are commensurate with what our goals are? I know you're going back and looking at those goals as part of the governance reframing, but will you look to fund those things we say we need to fund in the future as part of a budget process?
So Chair, just for clarity, are you referring to from a resourcing perspective within the new service area or from a project delivery perspective?
Yeah, so both the staffing component, which we've heard that the lack of permanency has been an issue, and the funding of objectives the city has, which Cyril has spoken to within the budget, that those things would be funded through a budget process into the future. I assume we're on the same page that the city wants to move in that direction.
So through the chair, maybe I'll take it. Will, you can top me off if I miss. Yeah, so on that point, I mean, this past budget, we added 3 new additional resources, permanent resources. So I think with the work that Will's doing, and also as a reminder, the AMPs that came forward last month, we will be coming forward with the long-range financial plans in 2025 to accompany those asset management plans, in which there will be the climate change lens applied to those plans. So as you can see, it's all kind of converging together where there's a multitude of financial plans coming forward for those considerations. So again, it's not just about, what's the right level of resourcing and where do those resources go? If I look at, in my department alone, there's probably, off the top of my head, probably at least 3 equivalent dedicated permanent resources focused on climate change. What does that mean? It means that most of my finance managers and accounting team are supporting the organization from that climate change lens. So that's the work that we're going to be doing with Will's team in terms of carving that down in terms of what does that actually look like and where do those resources fall? And then of course the governance will inform how all that information comes together.
Okay, no, thanks for that. That's helpful. I guess we get so caught up on this piece lately, I guess this term, because of this community emissions versus corporate organization emissions. And it's really, I think it's not a great strategy to break it down that way. Because we are accomplishing a lot of things and there's a lot of potential savings on the community side with some changes, right? So the potential for savings and things like the solid waste master plan into the future, the things that we've already done as a city on things like building retrofits, there's a big return there in the investment we're making. The e-buses, same thing. There's a great deal of corresponding savings on the operations side. And because we've been able to struck a deal with the federal government, it makes sense for us to move in that direction. It's the same with changes to the light standards. We made a big upfront capital investment in that, and now it's saving us money. It's not costing us money. So this discussion around sort of, well, how much is this $600 million to a tax equivalent? Is it 33% raising your taxes? Actually, no. The investments we've made so far are actually saving the taxpayer dollars. Every single one of those things is saving us money over time. Moving people, the city has a goal to move people to walking, to biking, to taking transit, scooters, as much as we can. Why? Because there's a huge operational savings when people take those modes. It means less impact on things like road widening, expensive road widening, expanding the urban boundary, huge long-term operational costs. So these are things that I think when we're talking about this, it's very easy to put in, political terms of this is a giant 33% cost increase for you, when actually the investments we've been making are saving ourselves money, saving the city money over time. And that low-hanging fruit is what we've been looking at thus far. So, just want to make sure that we're focusing in. Of course, we need community actions. Of course, we need organization actions. It would be ridiculous to outlaw one of those when these things are bringing savings to the city, and also reducing emissions at the same time. So look, just wanted to say thanks again to the Auditor General's team for your work and your actions, and to the committee chair for running the meeting today. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Menard. Councillor Hill.
Yes, thank you very much. This last question is it's about technology. I think our first delegate brought this up in terms of, focus and where focus is aligned. But I want to ensure that we are very seriously partnering with our private sector technology partners, Canada Tech Park and such, Invest Ottawa, that type of stuff, so that we can address and look to address the greenhouse gas emissions that are outside of the jurisdiction of Ottawa, because there's 99.9% of them are there. So if we can find innovative technological solutions that can be outsourced to other places to have a disproportionate impact than simply the defensive measures we're looking down and in within Ottawa, I think there's a potential for a disproportionate return on investment to the greenhouse gas emission outcomes that we're looking for. So I just want to make sure that we're not overlooking that pearl that we have in North Canada, and that we're tied at the hip to leverage their existence, so that we can leverage it both for Ottawa and more broadly.
So Chair, we'll be looking at every opportunity to advance our objectives.
Anything else, Councillor Hill?
No, thank you, Madam Chair.
All right, thank you. So I have a couple of comments from the chair and one question. So the comment on Hydro Ottawa that I made earlier, where Hydro Ottawa will be at the next council meeting to answer questions, I can't emphasize enough how many, exactly how many other councillors have said here, that the opportunity is great and real. The idea that they would take the Nepean Sportsplex, say the Canada Wave Pool, some of our buildings that are huge energy consumers, and renovate them. That can be done in sections. They don't have to close down the entire community center to do these things. The concept that, Hydro Ottawa would pay up front the costs that the city would then, be able to get back in the savings, to your point about the light project. So these questions, I'm hoping council will be able to ask at the next council meeting of Hydro Ottawa to say, what exactly are you proposing? What might that look like? Because, the city has to contemplate what that might look like. And that will be our great opportunity to get clarity there instead of just, Councillor Dudas and I understanding it as Hydro Ottawa board members. My other comment is on the data. I'm glad to hear, that is such a focus for sure. The real problem is that, as the Auditor General said, the data that they have in the report is simply the data that they could get, right? But it's the data that we haven't gotten yet. So that's not even in the report. And I would highlight exactly what many of you have highlighted, that, the LRT in itself, the amount of money that's spent on the LRT, have we really truly captured that in terms of how much greenhouse gas emissions have been saved or will be saved going forward? And that is a significant amount of money that we have invested in that I don't really think are in these numbers. But again, the point is made that the data isn't that accurate. And so, then how do we know even what we have is very accurate? So I'm glad to hear that that's going to be a major focus, because that will tell us a lot. The last question I have is, given what the Auditor General's report has said, basically we have a number of, criticisms, legitimate comments on what needs to be changed. Does staff have an idea yet of what might happen next? So in terms of the document we have, like a master plan is a significant document that staff take direction from. If it hasn't been clear, it's been confusing, there's misalignment, that's a real problem, I think, as a councillor, to hear. So do we go back to the drawing board? Do we rewrite it? Do we take out sections? Do we have energy evolution and we say this is an aspirational document only? I mean, what do you see as a possibility for our climate change master plan and for energy evolution?
So Chair, one of the things we spoke to in the management responses is really the sequencing of the events. So the first one we're proposing to undertake is that governance and how we'll be making decisions, what the role of council, senior management, my role, the service area will be. That once we have that established, then the next step is to work with council and SLT to understand how we're bringing forward and reprioritizing the priority projects that are identified in the master plan, what our targets are, all of those pieces, that comes next, but we need to establish what the framework is for making those decisions. It's the first item.
So it's possible there could be somewhat of a rewrite.
I'll defer to council on how they want to approach these things. We will be coming back to establish what the priorities are, and it's within council's decision-making to determine how they want to approach them.
Okay, super. Something else for us to think about. Okay, so as for this recommendation, the recommendation is that the audit committee receive the audit report and recommend that council consider and approve the recommendations. Is this item carried?
Carried.
Carried. Thank you. All right. Why don't we take a 5-minute break so that we can do this switcheroo here for our finance and corporate services department, and people can go to the washroom if they need to. All right, we do have quorum, so we can be ready to start. We generally ready?
I'm going to see the Beaver people after this, David.
Okay, we're not talking about beavers anymore. Finance and Corporate Services Department. Okay, so we now have the 2023 City of Ottawa Consolidated Financial Statements to look at and talk about. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. My name is Isabel Jasmine. I'm the Deputy City Treasurer for Corporate Finance for the City of Ottawa, and I will present the financial statements for the year ended December 31st, 2023. We also have KPMG with us today, Andrew Newman, the KPMG Managing Partner responsible for this audit, and the co-partner for the audit, Kevin Travers. They are here to present the results of the audit after I've made my presentation. Next slide. So we're reporting on an annual surplus for the year ended December 31st, 2023 of $865 million, which is different from the $33,000 surplus reported at the end of 2023 for budget purposes. Financial statements are reported based on Canadian public sector accrual accounting standards, whereas the budget is reported on a modified cash basis. There is a surplus on an accrual basis because it recognizes revenue that is not included on a cash or budget basis, such as assets contributed from developers, the share of earnings from Hydro Ottawa, and expenses include the annual depreciation of the historical cost of assets, which tends to be a lower cost than what is contributed to capital annually on a budget basis to replace those assets. In 2023, overall revenues increased by $2 million due to an increase in taxation and fees and user fee revenue of $233 million. Contributed tangible capital assets of $19 million, development charges of $2 million, and other revenue of $3 million, which was offset by decreases in government transfers of $239 million from previous years, primarily from COVID and LRT funding. Total expenses for 2023 increased by $229 million, which represents an increase of 5% from the prior year, primarily from inflation. It should be noted that the largest increase of $115 million was related to social and family services related to increased funding that the city paid to childcare providers under the updated Canada-wide early learning and childcare system, which is a flow-through offset by increased revenues. Next slide. The net debt is the difference between our financial assets and our total liabilities. It is a measure of the future revenues required to pay for past transactions. Net debt at the end of 2023 was $3.4 billion, but this is offset by non-financial assets of $22.4 billion, which is primarily made up of tangible capital assets. The net book value of tangible capital assets increased by $1.3 billion during 2023, and this reflects the increased investment in capital made by the city, mainly for Stage 2 LRT of $598 million, water and wastewater infrastructure of $474 million, and roads-related projects $199 million. A substantial portion of this capital investment includes assets contributed from developers to the city of $488 million, primarily in the form of roads, water, and wastewater infrastructure. The difference between net debt and non-financial assets is the accumulated surplus, which represents all of the accumulated surpluses of the city since its inception. Much of that balance is not in the form of cash, but in the form of capital, infrastructure, and reserves built up over the years. And this accumulated surplus represents the assets that are available to service future generations. The city's overall accumulated surplus increased by $903 million in 2023 to a total of $19 billion. The increase is primarily due to the annual surplus of $865 million reported on the previous slide. Next slide. Accounts receivable decreased primarily due to reduced government funding invoices outstanding at year-end for light rail, reduced cost recoveries for extraordinary policing compared to the previous year, as well as reduced COVID-19 related funding for transit safe restart and for vaccine distribution. Investment in government business enterprise represents the net assets of Hydro Ottawa, which we report on our financial statements on an equity basis. The city received dividends from Hydro Ottawa in the amount of $20 million in 2023 related to the results from the Hydro Ottawa's 2022 operations. The loan receivable is for the Stage 1 LRT loan to RTG from long-term lenders that was assumed by the city in 2019. Next slide. Accounts payable and accrued liabilities have decreased by $24 million, primarily due to a reclassification of the bond premium liability that was moved in 2023 to the net long-term debt. Deferred revenue has increased by 137 million, primarily due to a change in accounting for government gas tax funding that was received but not yet spent, that is now recognized as deferred revenue. Gas tax received from 2022 but not spent yet was restated and increased deferred revenue by $120 million. Asset retirement obligations is a new liability item added to the financial statements and is made up of costs that are expected to be incurred as a result of the retirement of tangible capital assets. The largest liabilities are related to asbestos in buildings as well as for active landfills. The next slides will provide additional details on the next two major items, which is employee future benefits and pensions, as well as the net long-term debt. Next slide. So employee future benefits increased by 41 million, mainly due to increases in WSIB related to certain cancers. These liabilities represent benefits earned but not payable until future years. The amount payable in the current year is budgeted for each year, and changes in future liabilities are primarily because of changes in actuarial assumptions and legislation. This future liability is an estimation and may or may not reflect the actual amounts that could be paid in the future. The most significant changes include post-employment benefits increased by 16 million based on actuarial consultants' estimation of this future liability. The City of Ottawa Superannuation Fund cost of living indexation liability increased by 2 million due to the increase in CPI, and the estimated future liability for WSIB increased by 23 million. Next slide. Debt is only used to fund capital expenditures, which have a long life, to which we can match the term of the debt for the life of the asset. When you look at the debt level compared to the total cost of the city's gross capital assets, it represents 11.3% of those assets. Our net long-term debt increased, reflecting the issuance of 202 million of net new debt issues and loans, which is offset by 148 million of debt principal repayments made during 2023. Principal and interest payments are restricted in two ways. Council has established a specific target for debt whereby principal and interest payments for tax and rate supported debt are not to exceed a combined target of 8.5% of the city's own source revenue. In 2023, this percentage was 4.7%. The provincial measure looks at the cost of debt issued, including mortgages, as a percentage of own source revenue, and that limit is 25%. In 2023, this measure is calculated at 8.2%, which is far below the provincial limit. Compared to other large municipalities, Ottawa continues to have one of the lowest total debt per capita. Next slide. The overall net book value of the city's tangible capital assets increased by 1.33 billion in 2023. The most significant construction projects contributing to the increase are 598 million for light rail stage 2, which is reported in assets under construction, 199 million for roads infrastructure, and 474 million for water and wastewater infrastructure. As you can see from the chart, water and wastewater infrastructure makes up 29% of the total tangible capital asset net book value. The LRT Stage 2 capital asset costs are still accumulating within the assets under construction category. Once Stage 2 is put into service, those asset costs will then be transferred to the LRT asset category. This concludes my presentation, and I will now pass it to Andrew Newman for KPMG for an overview of the audit results. Thank you.
Great. Welcome, Andrew and Kevin.
Now, can you hear me? I'm never sure if I have to press or if it's automatic. So thank you, Madam Chair, for that welcome, and certainly pleased to present a summary of our findings to date on the audit. I do have, as Isabel mentioned, Kevin Travers, my co-partner here on the audit. Kevin, as members know, is the current audit partner for the City of Toronto, as well as other municipalities, and is a former leader of our city practice across Canada. So he brings great knowledge both to us as an audit team, but and also to the city. Before I begin, I do want to thank the city team for their participation. First-time audits with first auditors are never easy, although we do try our best. And I think this year was maybe a bit more challenging than most first-time audits because we did get a late start due to contracting, et cetera. We didn't really get started till January. And as well, the number of new accounting standards and other transactions that Isabel so eloquently discussed just previously. But I am pleased with the teamwork that my team and your team demonstrated. We believe that we worked with our audit clients, and I think that it has certainly happened in this case. I don't usually do this, but I do also want to give a special accommodation to your manager of accounting and reporting, Luke Sinecal, who I work quite closely with on some improvements on the financial statements and other items, and he certainly worked with me and worked hard on these financial statements. So I do want to state that for the record. I'll go to the next slide, please. So the status of the audit. So our audit work is continuing as we complete the audit, but we are confident in the draft financial statements presented here today that Isabel presented. And on this slide, you will see some of the outstanding items. The two key things to remind the committee of is that the financial statements do remain, quote, open for any significant subsequent events, including matters of litigation that may need to be reflected in these financial statements, which may require an adjustment to the financial statements. If that is the case, we will certainly, through the chair, provide you that information. We do anticipate being fully completed with the audit by the council approval date of June 26th. And I'll just move to the next slide, please. Our auditor's report, members looked at and read, and I certainly hope you did. It is the clean, quote, clean opinion that you should expect from your management team. There is a number of additional paragraphs in that auditor's report relating to the adoption of new accounting standards, the revision of recording of the gas tax funding, which I will get into, and as well noting that the previous statements were reported on by a predecessor auditor. So it is longer than normal, but all those paragraphs are required. I'll just move on to the highlights page. So first I do have to comment to the committee that our materiality, or financial materiality that we presented when we presented the audit plan of 110 million did not change during the audit. Within the financial statement presentation, we did, as I mentioned, work with city staff on some improvements, we believe, on financial statement presentation and disclosure. We believe the statements are much better and reflect best practices across the municipal sector, particularly in Ontario. So I do want to thank your manager of accounting and reporting for being open to those changes. With regards to the new accounting standards, Isabel talked about the asset retirement obligations, which have been reflected on a retroactive perspective, and that impact is disclosed in note 25, as well as financial instruments, which was implemented on a prospective basis, which was also not disclosed in note 26, and those have all been done appropriately. Significant risks, as I work down the slide. We identified the consolidation. As you all know, the city has a lot of different entities that are consolidated in, so we did look at that as a significant risk where there could be a potential for misstatement in the statements. It is done, which is common through Excel spreadsheets and whatnot. So we looked at that, and that work is done, and we are fine with that. And in addition, this sometimes causes some consternation by members of audit committees. We are required to look at a presumed risk of fraud with regards to the potential that management override may have a material misstatement in the financial statements. There's required work that we do looking at journal entries, things such as that, and inquiries, and we have done that work, and we are satisfied. That is nothing with relating to the city. That is, every single audit in Canada has that presumed risk. Every single auditor in Canada does exactly the same thing, regardless of the size of the entity being audited. We have one uncorrected misstatement at the moment, which is basically a reclass between accounts payable and employee future benefits relating to community housing. It's basically between two lines and liabilities, so it's not a big deal, and certainly 9.2 is significantly less than $110 million, so we are okay there. And then the corrected misstatement with regard to gas tax funding, and this issue actually goes back to 2013, where there was much discussion in the accounting community for cities across Canada, but particularly in Ontario, with regard to the reporting of gas tax funding by Ontario municipalities. when a then new accounting standard called government transfers was implemented. Kevin and I are very familiar with that debate, given the roles we played at the time. I was actually vice chair of Public Sector Accounting Board at that time. The issue is fundamentally whether that gas tax funding was recorded as a revenue when received or when expended for the actual capital projects that it was intended to funding, and whether those stipulations are met. The debate in 2013 and 14 was quite furious, I would say, but over time, the practice of Ontario municipalities have coalesced to recording those gas tax funding, those amounts under the exact same agreement as revenue when expended. In fact, 29 of the 30 largest municipalities do record gas tax in this manner. Ottawa was the lone exception. So we raised this with management, and they decided to quickly do the right thing and to adjust the financial statements to be consistent with the other municipalities. Under Canadian accounting standards, this is called an immaterial prior period error, but it's an error in interpretation, not in accounting of amounts. And I do want to assure this committee that we did not identify any issues in the recording and approval of transactions, nor the eligibility of projects funded by these gas tax revenues. This is solely an issue of interpretation of the standard and of the agreement with respect to financial reporting. It also does not fundamentally change the city's available gas tax resources or its financial position. It's at the end of this current year, you have about 167 million of unspent amounts from gas tax. Those have to be spent on capital. They had to be spent on capital before, regardless of where it sits on your balance sheet. It has to be spent on capital, and I'm sure there's plans in the future to expend that. Lastly, as I finish up, we did not identify any significant control deficiencies in internal control, including in our IT work and information technology work that we did around IT controls. We did identify some performance improvement opportunities, as auditors are wont to do, which have been and will be shared with management for their verification and response, and we expect that it will be shared with the committee at a future meeting. And Madam Chair, that concludes our report. We certainly welcome questions.
Thank you very much, Andrew and Kevin. All right, committee members, questions? Questions for KPMG? Councillor Hill.
Thank you, Chair. I guess my question for KPMG, more of a broad one, is when you look at our debt ratio, how does this compare to other municipalities, perhaps in Ottawa or more broadly, in terms of our exposure to long-term financial risk?
Thank you for the question. We didn't actually do a big analysis on that, but I do have Kevin here who might be able to give maybe a high-level answer to that question.
Thanks, Andrew. Yeah, through you, Chair. So with respect to that question and the comparison, so firstly, as Isabel pointed out, you're well within the debt repayment limits in general. So in quite with a lot of room to spare on that area. But what makes the comparison difficult is not only the size of the municipality, but where they are in terms of the age of the infrastructure. So, and how their infrastructure ultimately gets financed. But I would say that right now that Ottawa is in very good shape compared to other large municipalities with respect to the current debt load that you're handling. So there is certainly room for more, but it's difficult to compare based upon that, otherwise having to go back and look at what the next 5 years look like in terms of asset replacement. And we don't have that data in front of us to compare.
Okay, thank you very much, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Kavanaugh.
Yes, thank you. Hello, Andrew. Nice to see you. I recall you being at school board when I was chair of Audit Committee there. So welcome to Ottawa. I hope it sounds like it was a tough audit in terms of not straightforward in terms of fixing things and stuff. But this is a question that I was wondering about is in terms of IT. I see you got IT specialists, and is this a bigger section of the audit, especially with cybersecurity, et cetera?
Bigger is a comparative word. I'm not sure bigger than what. It is an important part of our audit. We do look at your IT controls. We do have specialists that look at that deal with the city's IT team. We do look at things such as change controls around coding, access controls, password controls. Certainly, we do look a little bit at cybersecurity controls, but it certainly is nowhere near a cybersecurity audit. I will caution you on that. And in particular, whether there were or were not any successful cyber attacks that would relate to the financial reporting system. So it is a big effort, particularly Teresa in the very first year, because our team is getting to, starting from ground zero and learning the system and things such as that.
Oh, thank you. No, I should have used the word growing because it's more the fact that it's becoming more of a priority as time goes on, and you obviously hired specialists in it.
Yeah.
So that's kind of what I was getting at. Anyway, nice to see you. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Lowe.
Thanks very much. My only questions around the $167 million that was misclassified, I think the term you used was for the gas tax. It being accumulated surplus, or it being recorded as accumulated surplus, and it should be deferred revenue, if my understanding is correct. Does that doesn't change that doesn't change how that money can be used, or rather, does the misclassification sort of tell us where the money can be used in an incorrect manner? And then now that you or city staff are going to classify it properly, does that change where that money can go in terms of how, like, the perception of it?
No, it does not change where the money can go. The restrictions on the use of that funding is in the Government of Ontario gas tax agreement that is common across Ontario. The classification within the balance sheet, you got correct, Councillor Lowe. It is between accumulated surplus and deferred revenue. In the past, it was disclosed in the accumulated surplus note as a restricted reserve, right, and identified that it had to be used for projects that are eligible under the gas tax agreement. So, so that is it. Kevin, do you have anything to add on that?
No, you've nailed that, Andrew. It's really a geography item on the balance sheet.
Yeah, that's what it sounds like to me. Okay, I think the way I wanted to actually word the question was that doesn't open us up to any risk of having misused any of those funds, right?
No, as I mentioned, and I want thank you for the opportunity to reiterate the point. We found no instances where the money was used, no instances of non-compliance with the Ontario gas tax agreement and the federal gas tax agreement with the city, and things were accounted for in the right period. It's simply, as Kevin likes to say, an issue of geography within your financial statements.
Councillor Brown can tell you stuff about geography. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just on that very note, though, I guess I find it bizarre that from 2013 we were the only municipality that did it this way. I guess I was wondering, I understand that there was arguments at the time, about how to do this, but why is it then we didn't decide to go with the other 29?
I will pass to Isabel. I just want to correct the chair respectfully. In 2013-14, you were not the only municipality who did it that way. As I mentioned, this is I won't bore you with standard setting, but when the board approved the government transfers, we knew it would be, quote, a standard of interpretation, and there would be different interpretations to start, and eventually common practice would coalesce around one. That is what has happened here, from 2013-14 onward to here we are in 2023, and Ottawa is the only one of the 30, but I'm sure Isabel has more comments on this.
Yeah, and I would just say that our previous auditors supported the previous accounting standards. We informed them of the change because of we are comparing to previous year, and they are still comfortable with the different approach. So it's more of that's the way it evolved. But when we found out that most municipalities are following this other way of accounting for it, we immediately changed.
Okay, fair enough. It helps to have a viewpoint of other municipalities. It is important to know what others are doing, even if it is not the biggest deal in the whole world. All right, any other questions from anybody? Any other comments from staff? If you wanted to say anything else, I don't know. I'm looking at anybody. No? Well, we really appreciate this very much. Thank you. It's always fun to have a new Auditor. I don't know
Maybe
if
not for your
that's-
staff, but, Madam Chair, could I just interject for 1 second? Just for the purpose of the minutes, I neglected to talk about the sinking fund, and I know you're recommending those statements as well. Basically, what I said goes for the sinking fund audit as well, but I thought I should put that on the record as well.
Okay, sure. That is our next item, but if you, then you feel
Okay,
you've
sorry.
now said the same thing, ditto to all of
Yes.
it.
Yeah, we don't actually have a separate audit findings report for the sinking fund. We put them together.
Okay, great. So we have a recommendation then to approve, so that the audit committee recommend council approve the 2023 City of Ottawa consolidated financial statements. Is this item carried?
Carried.
Carried. All right. Well, thank you very, very much. And now we will carry on with our sinking fund item. 5.2. There's no presentation on this. So councillors, questions on the sinking fund? Councillor Brown, I thought this was your favorite item or something to that effect.
It is, but I just don't have any questions.
He was so excited about this. There are no questions on our sinking fund. No, we're all happy about debentures. We're all good. Okay. So let me just think about this. There's a matter, yeah, I have to read it. That the audit committee recommend council approve the sinking fund financial statements for 2023. Is this item carried?
Carried.
Carried. All right. Thank you. So we move on to item 6. Thank you all very, very much. In camera items, there are none. Notices of motion. Are there any notices of motion? I don't see any. All right. Inquiries. Are there any inquiries? I don't see any. Any other business? No? All right. So we are adjourned. Our next meeting is Monday, June 24th, 2024, where that will be the topic of Lansdowne. So we can all look forward to that. All right. Thank you. We are adjourned.